Hey everybody, this is chapter 1 of Althusser, The Detour of Theory by Gregory Elliot. Chapter 1 is titled The Moment of Althusser. Quote, I would never have written anything were it not for the 20th Congress and Khrushchev's critique of Stalinism and the subsequent liberalization. But I would never have written these books if I had not seen this affair as a bungled de-Stalinization, a right-wing de-Stalinization which instead of analyses offered us only incantations, which instead of Marxist concepts had available only the poverty of bourgeois ideology. My target was therefore clear. These humanist ravings, these feeble dissertations on liberty, labor, or alienation, which were the effect of all this among French party intellectuals, which I'm assuming means, what's his name? I think it's Roger Garaudy, but also the other guy, Lucien Sèvres. That's my guessing. Like people in the Communist Party. And my aim was equally clear: to make a start on the first left-wing critique of Stalinism, a critique that would make it possible to reflect not only on Khrushchev and Stalin, but also on Prague and Lin Piao. I think it's Lin Bao is how you say that. Now it's written Lin Piao, but here. That would above all help put some substance back into the revolutionary project here in the West, end quote. Louis Althusser. Quote, a philosophy does not make its appearance in the quote, a philosophy does not make its appearance in the world as Minerva appeared in the society of gods and men, end quote. Louis Althusser declared in 1975. This first chapter will be concerned with the four interrelated areas which form the context and shape the character of Althusser's original intervention: the crisis in the international communist movement after Stalin, the adjustment of the Communist Party of France to de-Stalinization, the configuration of Marxist theory in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and the disposition of the French intellectual landscape when Althusser came to write. It will provide a summary account of Althusser's relation to the, quote, existing state of affairs, end quote, and his alternative to it, preliminary to a closer consideration of his reconstructions, their ramifications, and rationale in chapters 2 and 3. After Stalin, the deluge. However recondite their subject matter, Althusser always insisted that his philosophical writings of 1960 to 65 were to be read and judged as complementary theoretical and political interventions in a particular conjuncture. On his own testimony, it was the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU, which, quote, obliged me to throw myself into the battle, end quote. A decade after the publication of the book For Marx and the book Reading Capital, Althusser characterized their purpose thus, quote, these texts, are explicit interventions in a definite conjuncture, political interventions in the existing world of Marxist philosophy, directed at one and the same time against dogmatism and the rightist critique of dogmatism, also the philosophical interventions in politics against economism and its humanist, quote, appendix, end quote. Althusser. The context of Althusser's intervention, then, was simultaneously theoretical and political. Politically, it was dominated by the two, quote, great events, end quote, signposts in the English introduction to the book For Marx, the 20th Congress and its aftermath, starting in 1956, and the Sino-Soviet split in the International Communist Movement, 1960. Althusser's later statement to the effect that he, quote, would never have written anything were it not for the 20th Congress and Khrushchev's critique of Stalinism, end quote, crucial as it is, can be deceptive, for the stress on the centrality of, quote, 1956 and all that, end quote, can obscure the equivalent significance of the breach between Moscow and Peking. It is essential to understand that Althusser intervened on some of the questions raised by 1956 in the light and under the influence of the debates and divisions of 1960 to 63. Accordingly, Anderson is quite right to argue that, quote, the founding moment of Althusser's work was this entirely different conflict, the Sino-Soviet dispute, is the real political background to the writing of the book For Marx and the book Reading Capital. Failure to appreciate this point can lead to errors of interpretation. It is therefore necessary briefly to review some of the most important developments in the international communist movement in these years. The 20th Congress of the CPSU opened on the 14th of February 1956. 11 days later, Khrushchev delivered what is known as his, quote, secret speech, titled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences, to a closed session. Comrades, Khrushchev exhorted the delegates at its conclusion, we must abolish the cult of we must abolish the cult of the individual decisively. Once and for all, we must draw the proper conclusions concerning both ideological, theoretical, and practical work. End quote. There ensued what Roy and Joras Medvedev have described as a, quote, off-again, on-again policy, end quote, of de-Stalinization, which was criticized from two quarters, by those in the CPSU and the international movement opposed to the exposure, however limited, of the reality of Stalin's regime, and conversely by those for whom the anticipated process of revelation and renovation did not go far enough. It is these contrasting pressures, intensified by the volatile situation in Eastern Europe and internationally, which influenced Khrushchev's oscillations in the years that followed. The Soviet intervention in Hungary in the autumn of 1956 induced two reactions in the communist world, a revolt in the non-East European parties that remained minoritarian, but which ended with the exodus of many of the rebels and support from every affiliate of the international movement, and a rallying around the socialist mother country. The Communist Party of China, CPC, ultimately one of the most strident supporters of the suppression of the Hungarian rebellion, had fired a warning shot to the Soviets when on the 5th of April it published a response to the initiatives of the 20th Congress titled On the Historical Experience of the Dictatorship of the Proletariat, in which the CPC signaled a certain fidelity to Stalin's memory. And like he said, I think Maoism can be described as a form of ultra-voluntarist Stalinism. That's just my opinion. Nevertheless, for the time being, it towed the Russian line of controlled de-Stalinization. Indeed, for a year or so during the, quote, 100 Flowers campaign, summer 1956 to summer 1957, the CPC went further along the road of, quote, liberalization than the CPSU. Also, it should be noted that I don't know if he'll say this later, but Mao later says like it was an effort to bring the snakes from out under their rocks in order to smash them, because there was massive repression after the 100 Flowers campaign, because they elicited this criticism, which went way further than they expected it to go. Anyway, the, quote, rectification campaign, end quote, foreshadowed in the book On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People of February 1957, led one contemporary observer, Isaac Deutscher, let's say like a right-wing Trotskyist, to stop like the most pro-Soviet of probably one of the most pro-Soviet of all Trotskyists, who didn't even agree with Isaac Deutscher didn't even agree with Trotsky's position of political revolution in the USSR. He was what you might call like a reform communist who viewed the bureaucracy as capable of self-reform and democratization. Anyway, led one contemporary observer, Isaac Deutscher, to deem Mao's text on the correct handling of contradictions among the people of February 1957, quote, by far the most radical repudiation of Stalinism that has come out of any communist country so far, end quote. I wonder how Deutscher felt about the mass repression of Trotskyists in China itself. Probably not terribly important to him. Yet by the time it was published in June of the same year, a new, quote, anti-rightist, end quote, campaign had been undertaken. Soon China was in the throes of the unsuccessful, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, and on a collision course with its socialist neighbor. Unsuccessful is a very whitewashed way of describing the Great Leap Forward. It was a total human calamity. Anyway, henceforth Mao's face was to be set against any gesture of de-Stalinization. A tempestuous meeting in November 1957 of representatives of the Communist and Workers' parties concluded with a final declaration which endorsed the positions proper to the CPSU rather than assenting to Mao's reflections on, quote, paper tigers, end quote, although it included the Chinese thesis that, quote, revisionism or, quote, right-wing opportunism, end quote, was the main danger facing international communism. In December 1960, after a conference of 81 parties in Moscow, the Chinese delegation again signed a joint statement celebrating the, quote, unity of the socialist camp, end quote. Yet both of these gatherings were largely exercises in papering over the cracks. On the 19th anniversary of Lenin's birth, April 1960, the Chinese had published in Hongqi, that's how you say it, Hongqi, I'm not sure. The broadside, long live Leninism, in defense of the Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy against, quote, certain persons, end quote, explicitly rebuking Tito, but in reality dressing down Khrushchev. The article suggested that, quote, one may oppose dogmatism in the interest of Marxism-Leninism, or one may actually oppose Marxism-Leninism in the name of opposing dogmatism, end quote. Communist Party of China. The Russians, aware that they were the real addressee and taking advantage of the fortuitous 40th anniversary of the publication of Lenin's left-wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, responded with fulsome extracts from that work. It was against the background of this public shadowboxing that the results of the 22nd Congress of the CPSU in October 1961 were to be condemned as, quote, revisionist by the Communist Party of China. It objected to two main aspects of the proceedings, which it considered to be related. First, Khrushchev's critique of Stalin was renewed. Secondly, the program adopted by the CPSU confirmed the line of, quote, peaceful coexistence and competition, end quote, pursued by Khrushchev since he had assumed full control in the USSR. Khrushchev dubbed the Congress a, quote, Congress of the Builders of Communism, end quote, and the party program, quote, a document of true communist humanism, end quote. Khrushchev, referred to as the New Communist Manifesto, it set as the USSR's target the construction of communism within 20 years. The Soviet state was now declared to be a, quote, state of the whole people, end quote, and the CPSU a party of the whole people. Quote, everything in the name of man, for the benefit of man, end quote, became the ideological watchword of Khrushchevism at home and abroad. Translated out of the Russian context, what these perspectives meant for the communist parties and the, quote, socialist camp was the prioritization of the, quote, struggle for peace, end quote. This had been the burden of the, quote, peace manifesto agreed by them in 1957. The objective was for the USSR to outstrip the USA in industrial and technological prowess, hence the vaunting of the Sputnik launch in October 1957 and Gagarin's orbit of the Earth in April 1961. Thereby demonstrating the inherent superiority of the rational, planned socialist system over the anarchic, quote, historically outdated capitalist system, end quote. Briefly put, the economic contest between the USSR and the USSA was to be the, quote, main form of the class struggle, end quote. The duty of the communist parties was to fight to secure the kind of peaceful international environment in which the USSR, enjoying a period of respite, could implement its ambitious program of communism in one country. This favored the adoption by them of a gradualist constitutional and national strategy for the transition to socialism, which would not disrupt the post-war division of, quote, spheres of influence, end quote. Thus, once again, the strategy of the communist parties, even in the absence of any international ruling body, was to be aligned with Soviet horizons as represented by Khrushchev's detentism and symbolized by his repeated invocation of the, quote, Camp David spirit, end quote. An era of, quote, polycentrism may, as Italian Communist Party leader Palmiro Togliatti later claimed, have dawned. It was characterized by a struggle for the, quote, preservation of the status quo, end quote. While the Russian line appealed to many communist parties anxious to return to the, quote, national road, the Chinese were simply not prepared to go along with it because it was, so they believed, incompatible with their national interest and the construction of communism in their country. still an outcast among imperialist nations, and locked in dispute with the USSR over economic aid, nuclear technology, and the Sino-Indian conflict, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis and the socialist merits of Yugoslavia and Albania. They had reached the breaking point. A meeting between the delegations of the two parties scheduled for July 1963 was upstaged by the publication on the 14th of June of, quote, a proposal concerning the general line. Excuse me, one second. Excuse me. A meeting between delegations of the two parties prepared for July 1963 was upstaged by the publication on the 14th of June of a piece titled A Proposal Concerning the General Line of the International Communist Movement from the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China of an equally fierce rejoinder from the CPSU 1 month later. The meeting got underway as planned, but in this atmosphere of mutual recrimination, the talks made no progress and they were suspended on the 20th of July. 5 days later, to the fury of the Chinese, the nuclear test ban treaty was initialed in Moscow. The first casualty was the unity of the international communist movement. Whatever one's retrospective judgment of the importance and sincerity of the ideological content of these and subsequent polemics, there can be no doubt of their significance for communists at that time. Ultimately, at issue for the Chinese was, quote, whether or not to accept the universal truth of Marxism-Leninism, whether or not to recognize the universal significance of the road of the October Revolution, whether or not to accept the fact that the people still living under the imperialist and capitalist system, who comprise 2/3 of the world's population, need to make revolution, and whether or not to accept the fact that people already on the socialist road, who comprise 1/3 of the world's population, need to carry the revolution forward to the end, end quote. Communist Party of China. 9 comments form the reply to the Russian, quote, open letter of 14th of July, castigating Khrushchev's, quote, phony communism. They indicted the Soviets for collaboration with the Americans abroad and for abetting the restoration of capitalism at home. The famous piece, On the Question of Stalin, by contrast, concluded that, quote, he was primarily correct and his faults were secondary, end quote. Stalin was a, quote, great Marxist-Leninist, end quote, and, quote, a great revolutionary, end quote. Communist Party of China. 2 ideological disagreements recur in the Chinese polemics and were to be the doctrinal basis of the Eastern Schism in the international communist movement, the rejection of the Soviet conception of, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, considered to constitute an abandonment of anti-imperialism, and the repudiation of the perspective of a peaceful transition to socialism, perceived to be a line imposed by the exigencies of Soviet raison d'etat, rather than raison de la révolution, the reverse of a national strategy for socialism. The Russians stood accused of, quote, revisionism, in a word, of anti-Leninism. Khrushchev's dismissal in the autumn of 1964 made no difference. As the new leaders of the CPSU set about de-Khrushchevization, the Chinese began attacking, quote, Khrushchevism without Khrushchev, end quote. The battle lines in the communist world were drawn up for the next decade or more. One second. New section. Out of the ghetto, question mark. Inevitably, Althusser will have seen much of this through the prism of the PCF, the second largest and most thoroughly, quote, Bolshevized communist party in Western Europe. Quote, our epoch, Sartre later remarked, quote, obliged all men of letters to do a dissertation on French politics, end quote. Sartre. In common with many other intellectuals of his generation, Althusser had been rallied to socialism by the ignominious collapse of the Third Republic, the subsequent occupation, and the ensuing pattern of collaboration and resistance. The roles of the USSR and the PCF in the anti-fascist war had ensured that they emerged from the defeat of the Axis powers with enormous prestige. Boasting a membership of 500,000 in 1945 and commanding the loyalty of a quarter of the French electorate, the Communist Party of France was, as Sartre would recall, quote, our only pole, end quote, the locus of effective action on the left. Given this, 2 basic options were open, exemplified by the trajectories of Sartre and Merleau-Ponty on the one hand, Althusser on the other. The founders of Le Temps Moderne balked at the monolithic organization, petrified doctrine and authoritarian practice of the PCF, opting for, quote, compensation without adherence, end quote, anti-communism, end quote. The party's transformation was a precondition for the realization of the aspirations borne by the resistance. But the task of elaborating the sui generis Marxist philosophy which would aid this process could only be conducted outside its bureaucratized structures, albeit in, quote, fraternal dialogue, end quote, with it. The existentialist Marxist program fared badly. For a start, the PCF, unconditionally loyal to the USSR, rejected the very possibility of a, quote, third way, end quote, between American capitalism and Soviet communism, and in any event, post-war political history delivered its quietus, necessitating the stark choices which had earlier been refused in the name of a principled neutralism. Merleau-Ponty, persuaded by the Korean War of the imperialist nature of the Soviet Union and hence of the utopianism of Marxism, renounced it. For Sartre, by contrast, it was the, quote, end of idealism, end quote, and the beginning of, quote, realism. In a Manichaean political universe, Sartre elected to preserve, quote, alongside the PCF, persevere, quote, alongside the PCF. Althuser's choice was similarly unequivocal. Before the war, a militant in the Jeunesse Étudiante Chrétienne, Althusser had been radicalized first by the Popular Front and then, decisively, by the experience of French defeat. Mobilized in September 1939, Althusser was taken prisoner the following summer, spending the remainder of the war in a German camp, similarly subjected to the, quote, terrible education of deeds, end quote. Unlike Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, Althusser was led by the turbulent post-liberation years to join the Communist Party of France, his membership coinciding with deepening Cold War and intensifying class struggle. Althusser made his commitment in November 1948, just as a bitter, communist-led miners' strike was being crushed by riot police at the behest of socialist ministers. Indeed, by this time, the revolutionary hopes aroused by the resistance had been conclusively dashed. The previous year, Le Parti des Fusils, having, quote, lowered the red flag before the tricolor, end quote, and compromised with de Gaulle's France Libre at the war's close, had been ejected from Romadier's government. The alliance between the USSR and the victorious capitalist powers was no more. The Pax Americana had descended with its twin arms of Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, soon to be followed by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the common form established by Stalin in the autumn of 1947 to coordinate a unified communist response, criticized the French and Italian parties for their erstwhile policy of national unity, decreed the existence of, quote, two camps, the one socialist wedded to peace, the other imperialist and bent on war, and dictated a, quote, left turn by the communist parties. With, quote, tripartism, end quote, over at home, the Communist Party of France switched to the offensive, mobilizing the PCF's forces for the violent class struggles of the late 1940s. As French socialists were converted to Atlanticism, the communists reverted to a quasi, quote, third period, end quote, rhetoric. Denounced as an arm of Russian totalitarianism, the PCF retreated into its Stalinist fortress, loyally executing common form demands as the Cold War worsened. Membership, which had risen from 545,000 in 1945 to 800,000 the following year, declined to little over 300,000 a decade later. Despite this, under the Fourth Republic, electoral support remained in the region of 25%, and the PCF retained its position as the premier working-class party. Portraying opposition to American imperialism and its Gaullist and socialist allies as the continuation of the resistance, representing itself as the inheritor and defender of French revolutionary republicanism, and entrenching its position as the party of the working class, the embattled PCF remained a symbol of heroism for numerous intellectuals, the embodiment of indivisible socialist and national causes. Relations between the two were always strained, often tortured. Yet if some were alienated in these years of, quote, Stalinist hard labor, end quote, others, including Althusser, stayed the course. Sartre, an indefatigable polemicist throughout the Cold War, probably spoke for many when in 1952 Sartre leapt to the PCF's defense, arguing that, in the current conjuncture, a defeat for Stalinism would, in reality, be a defeat of the working class. For, were the workers to abandon the sole unifying instance able to impart, quote, class being, end quote, to them, quote, the universe will be bourgeois, end quote, left-wing intellectuals' dystopia. For his part, Sartre determined that, quote, declared that, quote, un anticommuniste est un chien, end quote, and adopted the role of compagnon de route, essaying a theorization of the party's political practice from outside its ranks. For those inside, on the other hand, who likewise equated party and class, the 20th Congress came as a, quote, earthquake. The dismay of the PCF's leaders was initially even greater. Ever accommodating to Stalin's dictates and reversals of line, they at first found it difficult to accept Khrushchev's de-Stalinization. General Secretary Maurice Thorez opposed the Congress's limited initiatives on Stalin. He always referred to the, quote, alleged Khrushchev report, end quote, let alone speculations by Togliatti about systemic, quote, degenerescence, dissuaded Khrushchev from rehabilitating Bukharin and other victims of the Moscow trials, and at the very least was sympathetic to the, quote, anti-party plot, end quote, of Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich in June 1957 to oust the Soviet leader. Nevertheless, under his leadership, the PCF did adapt to the new line sponsored by the CPSU. Until his death in 1964, Thorez avowed that, quote, proletarian internationalism is solidarity with the Soviet Union, end quote. Thorez, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, had been endorsed at the party's 14th Congress in July 1956. A Central Committee meeting in November 1961 affirmed the, quote, universal significance, end quote, of the CPSU's recent Congress, quote, from the historic decisions of the 22nd Congress, end quote. The resolution read, quote, French communists draw new reasons and strength for the struggle against the fascist threat and personal power for peace in Algeria, for the restoration and renovation of democracy, for peaceful coexistence and general disarmament, for socialism, end quote. As regards the last, the 15th and 16th Congresses, 1959 and 61 respectively, marked the PCF's official orientation to, quote, peaceful transition, end quote. By 1966, Thorez's successor, Waldeck Rocher, would announce on behalf of his colleagues that, quote, the position and desire of the PCF is clear. All its activity is directed to the goal of creating conditions favorable to a peaceful transition to socialism, end quote. Waldeck Rocher. The PCF's adjustment to the Khrushchevite line arose not simply from fidelity to the bastion of world socialism, but because there was an underlying compatibility between the imperatives of, quote, internationalism, end quote, and domestic horizons. Regardless of its official doctrine, the PCF had, in a sense, been pursuing an analogous line in impeccably French colors ever since the Popular Front, the sharp turn of 1947, issued in campaigns centered on, quote, on the, quote, struggle for peace, end quote, not plans for an insurrectionary prise de pouvoir. Defense of the USSR demanded the fostering of patriotic anti-Americanism with the aim of fomenting inter-imperialist contradictions. Paradoxically, intransigent internationalism took the form of a truculent nationalism, for example, in the drive against German rearmament, which claimed la patrie for its own against a perfidious bourgeoisie. As the international situation eased after the Korean War, the PCF once again looked to, quote, a united front, end quote, with the socialists, anxious to demonstrate solicitude for la France éternelle. It was, at best, equivocal over the Algerian cause, as it had been over the Vietnamese. When the War of Independence erupted in 1954, quote, the party must not be compromised, end quote, Thorez proclaimed. As proof of its respectability, it called for peace and a, quote, genuine union, end quote, voting, quote, special powers, end quote, to the Millet administration in 1956, only to discover 2 years later that salvation from the Algerian imbroglio was generally anticipated not from, quote, left unity, end quote, but from the return of de Gaulle. Evasive over French colonialism, the PCF was reduced to passivity as the Fourth Republic was buried beneath the Gaullist 13 Mai. Something, I don't know, is that 3rd of May? I don't know. I have no idea. I think Mai is May. That year, its vote fell to under 20% for the first time since 1936. Thereafter, the PCF's sights were firmly fixed on the, quote, restoration and renovation of democracy, end quote, as an intermediary stage in any transition to socialism, and end whose means were an electoral alliance with the socialists on a common, quote, democratic program, end quote. The consolidation of the Fifth Republic effected with the massive endorsement of le pouvoir personnel in the constitutional referendum of 1962 gave added impetus to the strategy of the, quote, outstretched hand, end quote. Henceforth, the PCF was effectively an electoral alliance with the socialists. The, quote, great schism, end quote, was over, even if the entente was not particularly cordial. In Althusser's Annus Mirabilis of 1965, the, quote, opening to the right, end quote, extended to supporting François Mitterrand as the left's sole presidential candidate. The crisis provoked by the Russian intervention in Hungary in 1956 did not affect the PCF as badly as its Italian or British sister parties. To be sure, the combination of pugnacious pro-Sovietism over Eastern Europe, timid nationalism over Algeria, and outright resistance to the least democratization of the party's internal regime led not only to Sartzburg, announced in the book The Spectre of Stalin, but to an active inter-party opposition. Disappointed by the political and theoretical fruits of de-Stalinization, leading intellectuals like Henri Lefebvre and Jean Toussaint de Sainty collaborated on oppositional bulletins and were expelled for their pains in 1958. The Sorbonne Let Cell was dissolved the same year for criticizing the leadership's stand on Algeria. 3 years later, Marcel Servine and Laurent Casanova were brought to book for their premature Eurocommunism. In each case, order was restored. Given the new crisis in the international communist movement from 1960 onwards, however, the most urgent counter-reformation was one against, quote, left, that is, Chinese heresies. This the PCF excelled at. Mindful of the spread of the Maoist bacillus within its own cells, the party vigorously supported the USSR in the Sino-Soviet controversies, provoking the riposte from Peking that its new course was, quote, out of keeping with its oath of dedication to communism, end quote. Communist Party of China, 1963. There's a footnote that I missed that says, the loyalty of many party members was severely strained by official caution. Among those who seemed to have taken a harder line was Althusser. According to a hostile commentator, together with his students, he attended a militant demonstration over Algeria called by the student union UNEF in October 1960. End footnote. The critiques of 1956, inspired by the Stalinism without Stalin of that year, were rapidly overtaken by this quite distinct development in the communist world. By the early 1960s, with the CPSU taking the lead, the, quote, normalized communist parties had repackaged much of the critique formerly directed at them by dissidents as the basis of their own programs. The Khrushchevites appropriated the arsenal of those who, quote, through the smoke of Budapest, end quote, had discerned the ghost of Stalin. The PCF's official intellectuals negotiated the passage from the ideological expediencies of Stalinism to those of Khrushchevism with relative facility. The party's leading philosopher was Roger Garaudy, Politburo member, editor of Cahiers du Communisme, and director of the Centre d'études et de recherche marxiste, formerly Witchfinder General, now dispenser of extreme unction. In quick succession, champion of Stalin and defender of the Khrushchevite faith, Garadi led the way, becoming the symbol, to borrow one of his own titles, of the transition from, quote, anathema to dialogue, end quote. And just as you know, generally in Marxism, some people might dispute this, but when someone says "ite" as opposed to "ist," so Trotskyite as opposed to Trotskyist, it's a term of disparagement. Thus were the coordinates of debate and division fundamentally restructured from 1960 onwards. Althusser, who remained in the PCF after Hungary, played no part in the ideological suppression of critics. Indeed, we have no contemporary statement from him on the events of 1956. By then he had only a few brief articles on Marxist philosophy, published in an academic journal and not a party organ to his name. What was their character? The first two, titled On Marxism and Note on Dialectical Materialism, formed a pair, being devoted to problems which would exercise Althusser throughout his career, the periodization of Marx's oeuvre and the nature of Marxism, arguing that the importance attributed to the writings of the young Marx commanded the interpretation of Marxism. Althusser took his stand on Marxism in summary of his intellectual biography in the 1859 preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. Accordingly, Marx's texts prior to 1845 were informed by the problematic of German idealism. The book, The German Ideology, represented the critique of this, quote, philosophical consciousness, end quote. The book, The Poverty of Philosophy, was the first entirely, quote, scientific text, end quote, from Marx's pen. If conceived as attempts to impart substance to the philosophical themes of his youth, the end of alienation and the, quote, end of history, end quote, Marx's later works, and those of his followers, were only worth as much as those themes, very little. For therewith Marxism was converted from a science into a philosophy. Footnote. Quote, in that case, end quote, Althusser writes, quote, Marxism sacrifices its scientific pretensions to become in some sort the incarnation of an ideal, which although certainly moving is utopian, and like any ideal gets entangled in both theoretical contradictions and the, quote, impurity, end quote, of concrete means the moment it seeks to bend reality to its demands. Conversely, if Marxism has nothing to do with any, quote, philosophical notion of this sort, if it is a science, it escapes the theoretical contradictions and practical tyranny of the ideal. The contradictions it runs up against are no longer those resulting from its philosophical pretensions, but simply the contradictions of reality itself, which it sets out to study scientifically and solve practically, end quote. Althusser. End footnote. Marxism comprised historical and dialectical materialism. Historical materialism was the science of history, designated historical materialism in order to differentiate it from all the idealist conceptions of history coeval with it. It had been founded not on men's self-consciousness or teleological utopian principles, but, quote, on the material dialectic of the forces of production and relations of production, the, quote, motor that determines historical development, quote, in the final analysis, end quote, end quote. Althusser. Footnote. Althusser refers readers to the 1859 preface, further citing texts by Engels, Lenin, and Stalin as instances of, quote, a profoundly scientific conception of history, end quote. End footnote. And its, quote, most profound characteristic, end quote, was that it, quote, not only inspires political action, but also seeks its verification in practice, developing and growing through political practice itself, end quote. Althusser. Passing in the second article to Marxist philosophy, Althusser commenced by noting that it had been developed by Engels, Lenin, and Stalin in particular. Footnote. The bibliography provided by Althusser of the, quote, the most important of the Marxist texts dealing with this subject, end quote, is standard for the period, with the interesting and proleptic exception of Mal's book, on contradiction, end footnote. Marx, Engels, and their successors regarded the dialectic as, quote, the most advanced form of scientific method, end quote. They had reproached the Hegelian dialectic for a, quote, schematism, end quote, whereby violence is done to reality in order to mold reality to the, quote, a priori structure of the dialectic, end quote. Transforming the instrument inherited from Hegel, they had, quote, retained its, quote, rational kernel, end quote. The general content of the dialectic, interaction, development, qualitative, quote, leaps, contradiction, ... This puts us in a position to specify the meaning of the famous, quote, inversion. It is neither reliance on a particular philosophical system, nor a sort of intrinsic virtue, an absolute, quote, logical necessity, that makes the dialectic indispensable to Marx and Engels. The dialectic is validated only by the dialectic's concrete utilization, by its scientific fecundity. The dialectic is validated only by the dialectic's concrete utilization, by its scientific fecundity. This scientific use is the sole creation of the dialectic. It alone makes it possible to speak of the dialectic as method. It alone makes it possible to speak of the dialectic as method, end quote. Althusser. As Lenin had argued in the book, What the, quote, Friends of the People, end quote, are, and how they fight the social democrats, Marx and Engels' dialectical method was simply the, quote, scientific method in sociology, end quote. Althusser. Or cited in Althusser. Stalin had therefore been correct to excise the teleological, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, from the, quote, laws of the dialectic, as had Mao to specify the concrete structure of its hitherto abstract notion of contradiction. The dialectic Althusser procured could only constitute a, quote, method of discovery, end quote, if the dialectic expressed the, quote, structure of reality, end quote. Althusser. This did not amount to a proof of the common charge of, quote, metaphysical materialism, end quote, entered against Marxism. However, since for dialectical materialism, it, quote, is not for a metaphysics of nature to deduce the structure of reality, it is the role of the sciences to discover it, end quote. Althusser. The object of Marxist materialism was not the objects of sciences. It was concerned with the fundamental epistemological question, primacy of matter or mind, coming down firmly on the side of matter. Marxist materialism supported the, quote, spontaneous materialism, end quote, of the sciences, whose practice was the, quote, origin and creation of all criterion of all truth, end quote, a conclusion that had nothing in common with mere, quote, pragmatism, but which did invalidate the epistemological question, endemic in classical philosophy. Marxist philosophy, Althusser argued, quote, articulates and consciously draws out the implications of the, quote, spontaneous practice, end quote, of the sciences, straightforwardly affirming the primacy of external reality. Marxist philosophy, Althusser argued, quote, articulates and consciously draws out the implications of the, quote, spontaneous practice, end quote, of the sciences, straightforwardly affirming the primacy of external reality, end quote. Althusser. Hence, the, quote, materialist theory of knowledge, end quote, was utterly distinct from the materialist theory of knowledge's idealist antecedents, for it was not some science of the sciences, de jure or de facto substituting itself for the sciences. Nevertheless, it was, quote, verified by the sciences, and had therefore rightly been adjudged a, quote, scientific philosophical theory, end quote. Althusser. Footnote. The last formula is Stalin's, end footnote. As such, materialism stood in, quote, a fundamental relation to the sciences, reminding the sciences of their true nature. Materialism ensures the sciences' survival and progress, end quote. Althusser. Quote, to safeguard the endless development of the sciences, to preserve the sciences from all forms of dogmatism and idealism, by reminding the sciences of their fundamental reality, such is the aim of materialism, end quote. Althusser concluded. A third early text, titled On the Objectivity of History, in 1955, an open letter to Paul Ricoeur, also treats an issue which would preoccupy Althusser, the question of the foundation of a science of history. Reproving Raymond Aron for relativism, Althusser argued that history possessed a similar, quote, rationality, end quote, to that of the natural sciences. Ricoeur was to be commended for demonstrating that, quote, the level of history is not that of immediate experience, that history of science is not and cannot be a resurrection of the past, that historical science is a knowledge of history, It is at this level that it is possible to discover in history a rationality, quote, of the same species, end quote, as that of the natural sciences. You clearly show that the moments of scientific practice in history, observation, abstraction, theory, correspond to the procedures of the experimental sciences, which are theoretical because experimental, end quote. Althusser. Yet Ricoeur had attempted to found the objectivity of the discipline of history on the historian's, quote, intention to objectivity, end quote, whereas it could only be rooted in the conformity, however approximate, of a theory of the historical object to the historical reality of which it aimed to produce objective knowledge. History, too, could be verified, confirmed as scientific, or falsified, refuted as ideological, in the same manner as the other sciences. Ricoeur had neglected the crucial moment of experimentation. For Althusser, by contrast, quote, history likewise can only be a science if it is experimental. Quote, history likewise can only be a science if it is experimental, end quote, subject in its case to the, quote, fundamental, quote, critique, end quote, of, quote, real history, end quote. Althusser. For Althusser, by contrast, quote, history likewise can only be a science if it is experimental, end quote, subject in its case to the, quote, fundamental, quote, critique, end quote, of, quote, real history, end quote. Althusser. Likewise, criticizing arguments for a methodological distinction between the natural and the human sciences, predicated upon philosophical humanism, Althusser observed that history was arraigned for, quote, threatening men with the loss of the charms or dramas of immediate existence because it understands their necessity and their laws, end quote. Althusser. But this was quite mistaken, for, quote, just as knowledge of the laws of light has never prevented men from seeing, so knowledge of the laws that govern the development of societies does not prevent men from living, or take the place of labor, love, and struggle. On the contrary, knowledge of the laws of light has produced the glasses which have transformed men's sight, just as knowledge of the laws of social development has given rise to endeavors which have transformed and enlarged the horizon of human existence. The antinomy of history as science and lived history ends when we give up expecting from science anything other than what it imparts. It ends when we conceptualize the level at which scientific truths are established. It ends when we conceive the, quote, I don't know why I said quote, when we conceive the practical destination of science. It ends when we conceive the practical destination of science, which starts out from immediacy and descends to generality, to laws, only in order to return to the concrete, not as the duplicate of immediacy, but as an active understanding of immediacy, end quote. Althusser. Althusser's, quote, early works seem to have attracted little attention at the time, and have not done so since either. Footnote. The article, Note on Dialectical Materialism, was, however, treated to caustic criticism by transforming Marxism into, quote, magic, in a footnote in Merleau-Ponty, 1973. End footnote. Yet they are of considerable interest insofar as they give some indication of his stance in the 1950s and allow us to measure the distance traveled by the time of the books 4 Marx and Reading Capital. Thus, we shall see that the anti-Hegelianism, anti-historicism, and anti-humanism already evident in them was to assume more substantial shape thereafter, that Althusser's later versions of the institutionalized duo of historical and dialectical materialism were to take a quite different and much more original form, less dependent on discredited authority for a start, that some positive aspects of these short texts disappeared, for example, insistence on the empirical moment in historical science, while others were to reappear. The conception of Marxist philosophy is, in certain respects, a striking anticipation of Althusser's second definition of Marxist philosophy. In any sense, they set out an agenda for the, quote, attentive and meticulous study, end quote, of Marxism invoked by Althusser. However, his first work of substance was a slender volume on Montesquieu in 1959. It was followed in 1960 by an edition of Feuerbach's writings of 1839 to 45. When Althusser's major writings began to appear in 1961, 8 years after Stalin's death and 5 years after Khrushchev's, quote, secret speech, it was in what Anderson has called, quote, an altered historical landscape, end quote. And again, it's Perry Anderson, coming from the conservative, more pro-Soviet end of Trotskyism. As influenced by Isaac Deutscher. For now, the interpretation of Marxism criticized by Althusser had been granted droit de cité by the communist parties. Althusser's own, quote, philosophical manifestos, end quote, were directed against the Russian line and the French replica of the Russian line, whilst intimating sympathy for the Chinese position. From Khrushchev's critique of Stalin, Althusser drew different conclusions from those of the Russian and French parties, quote, concerning both ideological, theoretical, and practical work, end quote. Althusser. Quote, de-Stalinization will de-Stalinize the de-Stalinizers, end quote, Sartre had confidently predicted in 1965. It had not. What had happened, as Lucio Coletti put it 10 years after his resignation from the PCI in 1964, was a, quote, process of renovation, ... in a patently rightward direction, end quote. Lucio Coletti. Althusser, bound by party discipline, was not at liberty to express divergent political opinions. As he pointed out in the introduction to the English edition, the essays collected in the book 4 Marx treated the theoretical problems posed in/by the period, not the political issues. Implicit in them, however, is the conclusion that Khrushchev's report, far from initiating a genuine de-Stalinization, had been a right-wing critique which hastened a rightwards evolution in the communist movement. The, quote, dogmatist knight, end quote, Althusser's expression for the Stalin era, he considered to be primarily an abandonment of the revolutionary legacy of Marx and Lenin. Equidistant from Stalinism and Khrushchevism, he was for de-Stalinization but against, quote, social democratization, end quote, the regression of the communist parties to the positions of the Second International, or de-Stalinization from the right. Unlike Coletti, Althusser still envisaged the possibility of return to revolutionary Marxism within the communist parties in the 1960s. Althusser's project, his, quote, wager, as one of his ex-collaborators was later to describe it, was the renovation of the political practice of the Communist Party of France by a restoration/renewal of Marxist theory. Footnote. See Rancière, page 58 to 9. Appropriately enough, then, Daniel Lindenberg has written that, quote, Althusser ... wanted to be the Luther of French Marxism, end quote. Lindenberg, 1975. Khrushchev's liberalization had opened up space for independent research after decades of stultifying orthodoxy and opportunity. Simultaneously, it had stimulated revisionism and given the green light to reformism, a threat. Like the CPC, the Althusser believed that Marxism and Leninism were being opposed in the name of opposing dogmatism. The requisite alternative was to return to the time before the Stalinist flood, to that original purity of Marxism which had been corrupted in the period which bears Stalin's name. 10 years later, Althusser was to define the political direction of his work as, quote, making a start on the first left-wing critique of Stalinism, end quote. Only ignorance of the work of Trotsky, among others, could allow Althusser to believe, in 1975, that in... Let me repeat that. 10 years later, Althusser was to define the political direction of his work as, quote, making a start on the first left-wing critique of Stalinism, end quote. It's fucking ridiculous. Only ignorance of the work of Trotsky, among others, could allow Althusser to believe, in 1975, that in the 1960s, Althusser had embarked on the first such critique. But from a communist who had joined the PCF during the struggle against the, quote, Titoite Trotskyist, end quote, such, quote, negligence is less surprising. The fact is that Althusser's search for an alternative to the Khrushchevite status quo and the Stalinist status quo ante was circumscribed by the horizons of the international communist movement to which he was loyal. And his return to Marx presaged, over and above any theoretical prescription, a complementary turn to Peking. For it was there that vehement dissent from the moderate politics of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of France's post-Stalin was to be found. Given that the Chinese contrasted the revolutionary Stalin with the treacherous Khrushchev, the resulting critique of Stalin was likely to be ambiguous. But China, proclaiming, quote, uninterrupted revolution, end quote, and the, quote, victory of people's war, end quote, appeared to Althusser to offer the inspiration for the revolutionary project that was the raison d'etre of the communist parties. In the communist movement, too, the east wind was prevailing over the west. Naturally, Althusser made no public statements in support of the Communist Party of China, to do which would have incurred his immediate expulsion from the Communist Party of France. Nevertheless, signs of Althusser's orientation are present in the essays collected in the book For Marx. It is confirmed by the testimony of Rancière and others. Above all, perhaps, it can be detected from the patent divergence between the direction of Althusser's thought and the evolution of his party. Two examples will be given at this stage. With the article Contradiction and Overdetermination, the gulf between Althusser's coded sympathies and the Communist Party of France's visceral anti-Maoism became apparent, earning Althusser the attentions of the party's official philosophical spokesman. Just as a side note, it seems like when I was saying before about Maoism being like an ultra-voluntarist form of Stalinism, which is evidenced by this kind of like being here of like the pro-Stalinist Stalin position of the Chinese. It seems like there's a very much a contradiction in my view, between Althusser's like structuralism and the voluntarism of Maoism. Maybe I don't know enough about Althusser or Maoism to make that determination, but that's something I'd be curious in. Also, wasn't Rancière's like break with Althusser toward like Maoism? I'm not sure. Anyway, published in La Pensée in 1962, Althusser's essay offered an explicitly anti-Hegelian account of Marxist theory at a time when the Communist Party of France was broadcasting the virtues of the, quote, Hegelian legacy. Not only did he reject the isomorphism of the Marxist and Hegelian dialectics, he did so by reference to Marxist political practice. And if his novel theorization of Lenin's theory and practice of revolution had a bizarre ring in comparison with the Politburo's perspectives on Fifth Republic France, the acclaim accorded to Mao's book On Contradiction bore a political import which is not lost on Althusser's superiors. Garrity intervened to charge him with a perilous, quote, pluralism, which impaired the, quote, monist basis of Marxism. Footnote, see Gardy, 1963. The theoretical and political consequences of Althusser's rejection of the Hegelian legacy were considered, quote, serious by Gardy. Quote, from the theoretical point of view, the introduction of this historical pluralism is effected to the detriment of materialist monism. Whatever the complexity of the mediations, human practice is one. ... Its dialectic constitutes the motor of history. To blur it under the real multiplicity of, quote, overdeterminations is to obscure what is essential in Marx's capital. The study of the major contradiction, bracket, between labor and capital, and bracket, of the basic law of development of bourgeois society. How is it then possible to conceive the objective existence of a basic law of our age, the transition to socialism? From the practical point of view, it risks obscuring the fact that this contradiction defines the coordinates of our revolutionary action, end quote. Gardy. Other senior critics also fixed on Althusser's supposed, quote, pluralism, such as Bess, 1963, was comparatively nuanced. Murray, 1963, as the title of his article, Materialisme et Hyper-Empiricisme, so I guess that's materialism and hyper-empiricism, that's my guess, suggests, as that title suggests, was very hostile. End footnote. Undeterred, Althusser renewed his attack and extended his research in an essay published the following August titled On the Materialist Dialectic. 2 months later, the PCF Central Committee met at Ivry to ponder the Chinese threat. In the course of its deliberations, Lucien Sèvres rebuked any flirtation with Maoist categories by party intellectuals, singling out Althusser's writings on the dialectic for reprimand. The following month, November 1963, Althusser was summoned before the editorial board of La Pensée to explain himself. Arraigned for leftism, he was obliged to affirm the correctness of the Communist Party of France's own line. And there's a footnote that says, we shall return to this episode in Chapter 4. That's one footnote. The other footnote says, see Althusser 1969a for Althusser's repudiation of the charge of pluralism and counterattack on his critics' invocation of monism. In an appendix to his text not reprinted in the book For Marx, Althusser suggested that Murray's critique demonstrated the inevitable consequences of conceiving Marx as Hegel, quote, inverted, quote, serious theoretical distortions of Marx's thought, end quote. Althusser. End footnote. 2 months later, the Communist Party of France Central Committee met at Ivry to ponder the Chinese threat. In the course of its deliberations, Lucien Sèvres rebuked any flirtations with Maoist categories by party intellectuals, singling out Althusser's writings on the dialectic for reprimand. The following month, November 1963, Althusser was summoned before the editorial board of La Pensée. So I already said that. Fuck. Rereading shit. My bad. Althusser's next article, titled Marxism and Humanism, was written in October 1963. Published in June 1964, it followed hard on the PCF's 7th Congress, where agreement with the Soviet Party had been registered on all the important issues, opening laconically enough, quote, today socialist, quote, humanism is on the agenda, end quote. Its echoes of the Chinese polemics are unmistakable. In their assault on the CPSU's, quote, out-and-out revisionist program, end quote, of 1961, the Chinese had laid the following charges against it, quote, the program crudely revises the essence of Marxism-Leninism, namely the teachings on proletarian revolution, on the dictatorship of the proletariat, and on the party of the proletariat, declaring that the dictatorship of the proletariat is no longer needed in the Soviet Union, and that the nature of the CPSU as the vanguard of the proletariat has changed. Wait, did I say quote? Sorry, fucking shit up. Quote, the program crudely revises the essence of Marxism-Leninism, namely the teachings on proletarian revolution, on the dictatorship of the proletariat, and on the party of the proletariat, declaring that the dictatorship of the proletariat is no longer needed in the Soviet Union, and that the nature of the CPSU as the vanguard of the proletariat has changed, and advancing fallacies of a, quote, state of the whole people, end quote, and a, quote, party of the whole people, end quote. It substitutes humanism for the Marxist-Leninist theory of class struggle and substitutes bourgeois slogans of liberty, equality, fraternity for ideals of communism. It is a revisionist program for the preservation and restoration of capitalism. End quote. Communist Party of China. Whereas the Chinese directly attacked the abrogation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the promulgation of new slogans, and so on, Althusser treated the Russian and French position sardonically, conveying his incredulity sotto voce. Quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat rejected by the Social Democrats in the name of bourgeois personal, quote, humanism, and which bitterly opposed them to the communists, has been superseded in the USSR. Even better, it is foreseeable that it might take peaceful and short-lived forms in the West. From here we can see an outline, a sort of meeting between two personal, quote, humanisms, end quote, socialist humanism and Christian or bourgeois liberal humanism. The, quote, liberalization of the USSR reassures the latter. As for socialist humanism, it can see itself only as a critique of the contradictions of bourgeois humanism, but also and above all as the consummation of its, quote, noblest aspirations. Humanity's millenarian dreams prefigured in the drafts of past humanisms, Chartism and Christian and bourgeois, Jesus Christ, Christian and bourgeois, will at last find realization in it. In man and between men, the reign of man will at last begin, end quote. Althusser. Althusser proceeded to demonstrate to his own satisfaction that humanism was an ideological concept, emphasizing, however, that his purpose was, quote, not to dispute the reality of the concept of socialist humanism, quote, not to dispute the reality that the concept of socialist humanism is supposed to designate, but to define the theoretical value of the concept, end quote. Althusser. After an elliptical and provocative run-through of Marx's theoretical development, Althusser concluded that one of the, quote, indissociable elements, end quote, of Marx's, quote, break in 1845 was, quote, the definition of humanism as an ideology, end quote, and moreover, quote, that this rupture with every philosophical anthropology or humanism is no secondary detail, it is Marx's scientific discovery, end quote. The logical conclusion was that the theoretical value of the concept was nil. Footnote. The same year as Althusser's anti-humanist article was written, Chao Yang was warning the Philosophy and Social Sciences Department of the Chinese Academy of Sciences that, quote, the modern revisionist and some bourgeois scholars try to describe Marxism as humanism and call Marx a humanist. Some people counterpose the young Marx to the mature proletarian revolutionary Marx. In particular, they make use of certain views on, quote, alienation expressed by Marx in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, to depict Marx as an exponent of the bourgeois theory of human nature. They do their best to preach so-called humanism by using the concept of alienation. This, of course, is futile, end quote. Quoted by Soper in her valuable 1986 book. End footnote. I think it's Kate Soper? I don't know. Wrote a book on humanism. Anywhooser, end footnote. Socialist humanism, masquerading as Marxism, was no more than the, quote, practical ideology, end quote, of the USSR. It furnished a compelling ethical critique of the inhuman form taken by the dictatorship of the proletariat under Stalin, but was otherwise, quote, an imaginary treatment of real problems, end quote, characteristic of ideology. It's very funny that, like, just knowing a little bit about, like, praxis Marxism and just, like, different Marxist strains within, say, like, the Eastern Bloc, and just and the discourse that I'm aware of between Eastern Bloc, like, party ideologues in, like, philosophy departments and so on, their harsh condemnation of the humanist reading of Marx makes Althusser's, like, critique seem kind of, like, vacuous. Insofar as like humanism was not the new dominant ideology in the USSR, or the interpretation of Marx as a humanist, and especially the discovery and the importance of 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, which were so important in the Western Marxist tradition, were routinely criticized and played down in the USSR. Um, I do know that for a fact. Check out any of the pieces that I have on here, for instance, by Irene Fetcher, or any of the pieces about like the life of Maximilien Rubel, for instance, and the kind of flack that they took. Anyway, socialist humanism masquerading as Marxism was no more than the, quote, practical ideology of the USSR. It furnished a compelling ethical critique of the inhuman form taken by the dictatorship of the proletariat under Stalin, but was otherwise, quote, an imaginary treatment of real problems, end quote, characteristic of ideology. And that quote's from Althusser. Any critique cast in its terms remained ideological. The, quote, cult of personality, end quote, was said to be a, quote, unclassifiable concept in Marxist theory, end quote. Althusser. If Althusser, unlike the Communist Party of China, did not publicly doubt that the USSR, for all the deformations in its superstructure under Stalin, was a socialist country, he was effectively accusing the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and its supporters in the capital C communist movement of abandoning Marxism in favor of bourgeois ideology. In their, quote, recourse to ideology, end quote, the Soviets were circumventing a materialist explanation and genuine rectification, question mark, of, quote, what has not yet been completely superseded in its effects or its misdeeds, ... terror, repression, and dogmatism, end quote. Althusser. The, quote, retreat to humanism by the Soviets, their supporters and their critics would not yield the requisite scientific analysis of Stalinism and thus obstructed the provision of a political strategy for a non-Stalinist socialism. And this is just ridiculous because there was massive efforts outside of the mainstream communist movement to actually give an analysis of Stalinism way before the early 1960s. Althusser was not then an unregenerate Stalinist, and his writings were not those of an apparatchik. Althusser opposed socialist/Marxist humanism insofar as this labile theoretical current had become part of an apologetic orthodoxy which pointed to the USSR as the socialist utopia in demand. And again, this theoretical current did not. He's like, I guess he's speaking within a very particular frame. I guess he's talking, his opponents here are like Garadi and Sev, but this is absolutely not the case for like the humanist interpretation of Marx broadly conceived. This is not the position, say, of like Eric Fromm or Raya Dunayevskaya or C.L.R. James or people in the Praxis School. A lot of the Praxis School's work, theoretical work, came a little after this, I think, or maybe contemporary with it. But the Marxist humanism, as such, and especially in the main, I would say in the main, as a philosophical current, was not this post-Stalinist current within like so like these that seems just kind of ridiculous to me personally. As he saw it in conjunction with an economic evolutionism, the theory of, quote, state monopoly capitalism, end quote, it was being employed pragmatically by the PCF as a theoretical garb for political opportunism. Footnote, state monopoly capitalism, Stamocap, was theoretical orthodoxy for the international communist movement. See Communist Party of the Soviet Union 1961. See also the Statement and Appeal of the World's Communist Parties issued following the November 1960 conference in Moscow. End footnote. The distinct danger was that it would be used to license a social democratization of the communist parties. The PCF, it appeared, had emerged from the ghetto at the price of a flight into, quote, democratic adventurism, end quote. The alternative to Stalinism and social democracy alike was a revival of Leninism. Althusser's Leninism may have been neo-Marxist, may have been neo-Maoist, but Marxist/socialist humanism was, in general, anti-Leninist. That is also not true. That is just not true. If you just think of other people that were talking about socialist humanism or the humanist dimension of Marx, either in the United States or abroad, and from my perspective, unfortunately, did not apply the critique of heteronomy and social domination or bureaucratism, or just like all of the kind of reproductions of hierarchical society that are reproduced in the concept of the vanguard party. They did not give a substantial enough critique of all that. The idea of socialist humanism being anti-Leninist as such is crazy. To adhere to its positions, Althusser believed, was to wrench political practice from its orientation towards the class struggle and consecrate, in theory, the practical abandonment of the revolutionary project. The real danger was political, but its site for Althusser was theoretical. Was Marxism a humanism? In the theoretical conjuncture of Althusser's intervention, most answers to this question were in the affirmative, and apparently Marxological issue, it was far from trivial in its practical implications. It was precisely the political content and effects of this theoretical position within the communist movement which determined the implacability of Althusser's opposition to it. In combating it theoretically, Althusser was contributing to a political cause. New section: The Misadventures of Marxist Theory. Althusser's first major essay on Marxist theory, titled On the Young Marx, was written in 1960 and published the following year. The opening shot in a concerted, quote, counterattack, end quote. Its immediate target was a collection of essays primarily by East Europeans devoted to the relation between the young Marx and the, quote, mature Marx. Footnote: see Recherche Internationale, number 19, 1960, containing by Hübner, Jan, I'm assuming that's Wolfgang Jan, is important East German Marx scholar. Lepine, I don't know who that is. Schaff, I'm assuming that's Adam Schaff, who was an exception, a notable exception to like the mainstream, to my understanding at least, and maybe I'll be corrected later in this text and I'll change my mind on this, but he was an exception within the mainstream of communism in the Eastern Bloc to accept a humanist position. He was like a high-ranking member, I'm not sure of this precise position, within the, I forget what it's called, the Socialist Party. I can't remember what the precise name for the Communist Party of Poland was. I think it was different than simply the Communist Party of Poland, but I'm not sure. Anyway, and footnote, insisting that, quote, any discussion of Marx's early works, end quote, was a, quote, political discussion, end quote, Althusser noted that throughout Europe, quote, philosophers, ideologues, theologians have all launched into a gigantic enterprise of criticism and conversion. Let Marx be restored to his source, and let him admit at last that in him the mature man is merely the young man in disguise. Or if he stubbornly insists on his age, let him admit the sins of his maturity. Let him recognize that he sacrificed philosophy to economics, ethics to science, man to history. Let him consent to this or refuse it. His truth, is contained in the early works. End quote. Althusser. Footnote, Althusser continues, quote, so these good critics leave us but a single choice. We must admit that Marx's Capital and, quote, mature Marxism, and, quote, in general, is either an expression of the young Marxist philosophy, or its betrayal. or its betrayal. In either case, the established interpretation must be totally revised, and we must return to the young Marx, the Marx through whom spoke the truth." End quote. Althusser's reference to theologians was in earnest. See especially Calvez, 1956. I mean, that is true, is that theologians were taking more of an interest in Marx's humanism. I do know that to be a fact. And I would be very, very cautious of thinking people that accepted Marx's humanism, like I reject this kind of either or thing that he has here, either an expression of the young Marxist philosophy or its betrayal. There's a lot of more sophisticated ways of relating, for instance, the economic and philosophical manuscripts to the critique of political economy, which definitely has within its text, if you just look beneath, I don't know, you don't even have to look, just like read it, definitely has within it substantial critiques of capital as a social form of heteronomy. Anyway, end footnote. Dissenting from the consensus he detected, Althusser retorted that Marx's youth pertained to Marxism only insofar it was amenable to Marxist explanation. His article might well have been entitled "Against the Young Marx." The following year, one of the early works under discussion, the economic and philosophical manuscripts, appeared under the imprint of the PCF's publishing house, Éditions Sociales. Althusser greeted this, quote, theoretical event, end quote, with a short review of La Pensée, February 1963, in which Althusser characterized the author of the Paris manuscripts as the, quote, Marx furthest from Marx. The, quote, Marx furthest from Marx, end quote. Althusser. As Althusser was well aware, his conclusions consonant with the Chinese position were something of a contemporary scandal. For the late 1950s and early 1960s were characterized throughout the continent by a return to the young Marx among Marxist intellectuals, both communist and non-communist. If the communist movement was in political peril, Marxist theory was ostensibly experiencing a renaissance, but it was a humanist revival. In France, classics were rediscovered, new works produced. Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, condemned by the Comintern the year after its publication, and hitherto known to a French audience largely through Merleau-Ponty's book Adventures of the Dialectic, was at last translated into French in 1960. I believe that this republication of History and Class Consciousness was condemned by Althusser himself and was against its republication, and he also and then I'm getting this from the book on open Marxism by Christos Mamos, that he openly he was very much opposed to this republication in the journal Das Argument, which was by Kostas Axelos, which is like in Mamos's work, like a very important figure in the history of open Marxism, as well as like the Praxis school people, the Praxis Marxists that I was talking about earlier. Anyway, Karl Korsch's contemporaneous Marxism and philosophy likewise emerged from oblivion courtesy of the Arguments series at Éditions des Minuit. Works by the Frankfurt School thinker Herbert Marcuse began to appear in translation. Henri Lefebvre's book Dialectical Materialism, published in 1939, a product of the first encounter with the Paris manuscripts, is reprinted in 1961 with a new foreword in which the author asserted that amid the dissolution of, quote, dogmatism, Marx's early writings became, quote, of the first importance, end quote. Henri Lefebvre. Of new works, Lucien Goldmann's book, The Hidden God, had appeared in 1956. Sartre's book, Search for a Method, and the monumental study it prefaced, Critique of Dialectical Reason, at the beginning of the decade. Not to be outdone by non- or ex-communists, Gaudi contributed Humanisme Marxiste in 1957 and Perspective de l'Homme 2 years later. I don't know if I've said this already. I probably have. Gaudi eventually converted to Islam and became a Holocaust denier. Anyway, rather than welcoming these developments, Althusser reduced them or their analogues as evidence of the deleterious effects of Khrushchev's critique. Flowers might be blooming in schools contending, but they were so many signs of the revisionist times. The flowers might be blooming in schools contending, I think, was like the official slogan of the 100 Flowers campaign, which was brutally corrupt, which I think was like a pretext for the so-called anti-rightist campaign immediately following him, drawing the snakes from under the rocks. Flowers might be blooming and schools contending, but there were so many signs of the revisionist times. Surveying the field of Marxist theory in the early 1960s, Althusser delineated two main paradigms, though with many variations on the themes, what Althusser called, quote, economism and, quote, humanism/historicism, end quote. The former, he contended, represented a Marxist version of technological determinism, the latter, humanism/historicism, a species of Hegelianism, both derived in the final analysis from ideologies which Marx had transformed in order to produce the science of historical materialism, English political economy and German idealist philosophy, and both led by, however devious a route, to another, and this was the political rub, utopian socialism. Althusser's conviction was that, irrespective of their intentions, they were alike pseudo and ultimately anti-Marxist. Neglecting the potentially critical effects of humanist Marxism on Stalinism, ignoring the humanist critiques of those who left the communist parties in 1956, but still remained Marxist, and attending to what he, and they, regarded as the Stalinism with the human face of Gaudi et al., Althusser failed to engage in any depth with the humanist recasting of Marxism. Althusser failed to engage in any depth with the humanist recasting of Marxism. Because the emperor's new clothes were socialist humanists, Althusser perfunctorily consigned all such theoretical positions to the camp of the right-wing critique of Stalinism, regardless of their actual stance towards the Kremlin, or Place du Colonel Fabien, I don't know. Whatever the danger of a turn to the right within socialist humanism after 1956, as opposed to an opening to the left, and the danger was not merely the figment of a Stalinist imagination, such an eventuality was by no means inevitable. And when he said, and there's a footnote here that says, see Anderson, 1980. Again, Perry Anderson, coming from the right wing of Trotskyism, the New Left Review Trotskyism, influenced by Isaac Deutscher, heavily influenced by Isaac Deutscher's interpretation of the USSR, which was even less radical than Trotsky's. So you have to, if you think that if you take a more radical position than Trotsky, or even more radical, and Trotsky was more radical than Isaac Deutscher, you should take their commentaries on, you should take their commentaries with a degree of caution. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but you should be cautious about them. In his monitoring of Marxism, Althusser thus failed to relate to the conjuncture in connaissance de cause. Yet it must be reiterated that Althusser's political suspicion of and consequent animosity towards such doctrines emanated from their confiscation and instrumentalization by communist parties. Having missed the moment of 1956, Althusser was confronted in the early 1960s by something approaching a transvaluation of values. Oblivious to the extent to which Marxism-Leninism, talisman of the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union alike, was itself part of Stalin's legacy to the communist movement. That's important. Oblivious of the extent to which Marxism-Leninism, talisman of the CPC and CPSU alike, was itself part of Stalin's legacy to the communist movement, Althusser raised its banner, castigating the heresy he saw all around him, except in Peking, impervious to the blandishments of Marxist humanism. Socialist humanism was now being exploited by the communist parties in their ideological struggle with, quote, barracks, i.e. Chinese, communism, end quote. In the Manichaean world of, quote, theoretical practice, end quote, There was science and there was ideology. Marxism was science. Socialist humanism with socialist humanism's counterposition of the young Marx to Stalin and systematic neglect of Lenin, the latter. The pervasive siren song of bien-pensant humanism was not for Althusser. The pervasive siren song of bien-pensant humanism was not for Althusser. It represented, on the contrary, the main contemporary enemy. For such, quote, revisionism and the source of reformism and only, quote, orthodoxy could effect a return to revolutionary rectitude. According to Althusser's theoretical typology, humanism and historicism constituted a, quote, return to Hegel, end quote, by Marxist intellectuals when Marx had done hard theoretical labor to break with Hegel and the entire, quote, German ideology. As paradigms, they negated what he called the, quote, epistemological break, end quote, which separated the science of history from any and every speculative philosophy of history. Humanism was precisely the specious theoretical formation with which Marx and Engels had decisively begun to part company in the German ideology in 1845. Its modern protagonists were consequently engaged not simply in an inaccurate exercise in Marxology, but in an erasure of the distinction between Marxism as science and Marxism as ideology, between Marx himself and his own ideological past, between Marx's Capital, the Marx that mattered, and the early works, most seductive of all the mirages in the post-Stalin theoretical desert. Above and beyond their accuracy as scholarly theses, Althusser's perspectives had these implications: that the truth of Marxism was not to be attenuated by any kind of pragmatism. To be, quote, for Marx was to be for the preeminence and scientificity of Marx's mature theory, historical materialism, that to deny or distort the scientific status of that theory was to oppose progress in Marxism, in theory and in politics. Althusser's, quote, essential thesis, end quote, the guiding principle of Althusser's whole intervention was that Marx had, quote, founded a new science, the science of history, end quote. Althusser. Preparatory to any rearticulation of the scientificity of Marxism was a critique of the 57 varieties of alleged impostor now occupying center stage. One would expect, at the minimum, an extended discussion by Althusser of Sartre's attempt to rejuvenate Marxism as the, quote, philosophy of our time, end quote. Sartre. As it is, one of the most salient features of Althusser's writing in this and subsequent periods is their lack of detailed attention to other contemporary versions of Marxism. Whilst this may be a structural trait of the Western Marxist tradition, it is particularly reprehensible in his case since he was conversant with, among others, Sartre, Lefebvre, and Pulitzer on the national stage, and Lukács, Korsch, Gramsci, De La Volpe, and Coletti on the international scene. Also to be regretted yet underscored is the mode of Althusser's critique of these writers. Despite elements of a historical and comparative analysis, all too often Althusser essayed a reading in which authors, despite the enormous differences between them, are distributed to common, quote, problematics, end quote, and for which the location of a putatively non-Marxist element is sufficient to disqualify their claims, sometimes even to be a Marxist. What briefly was the underlying logic of Althusser's Marxism of Marxism? Footnote. Althusser also cites the Austro-Marxists, whom he curiously dismisses, however, and the Russian Marxists Rosenthal and Ilyenkov, alongside such classical figures as Lenin and Plekhanov. Elsewhere in reading Capital, even Trotsky gets a mention in the company of Engels, Kautsky, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Stalin as a reader of Capital. End footnote. Both, quote, economism and, quote, Hegelianism had a long history. For the Second International, the ontological version of dialectical materialism extracted from Hegel's logic by Engels, and of which historical materialism was in effect merely a subset, acted as a guarantor of the inevitability of socialist revolution. The auto-development of the economic base, motored by the contradiction between socialized forces of production and restrictive relations of production, private property, would terminate the crisis-ridden capitalist system, quote, natural necessity, end quote, and the, quote, guarantees of history, end quote, thus exonerated the reformist strategy of, for example, the German SPD, after the, quote, Great Betrayal, end quote, of 1914 and the Russian Revolution of 1917, that, quote, revolution against capital, end quote, a la Kautsky and Plekhanov, a new generation of Marxist philosophers, the founders of, quote, Western Marxism, end quote, had sought to rescue Marxist theory, compromised by its association with imperialist carnage, vindicated by revolution in a, quote, backward country, by an anti-naturalist reaction against Second International orthodoxy. Where am I? In the case of Korsch and Lukács, at least, this further involved rejection of the supposedly debilitating philosophical legacy of the late Engels, the redemption of Marxist theory, namely its rediscovery of its revolutionary vocation, was to be achieved by reinterpreting Marxism as the, quote, supersession of classical German philosophy. This amounted to converting Marxism into a close cousin of the Hegelianism of the young Hegelians, an anthropological version of Hegel's book Phenomenology of Spirit. For the, quote, poor man's Hegelianism, end quote, economic evolutionism, which was official Marxism, they substituted the richer fare of the young Marx. Lined up against the Hegel of the Logic and the Marx of Capital were the younger Hegel of Jena and the young Marx of Paris. The proletariat, Lukács avowed in 1919, quote, is the sole legitimate heir to bracket classical German and bracket philosophy, and its true executor. Its true executor, end quote. End quote, Althusser. In this perspective, theoretical Stalinism was, as Althusser later put it, a kind of, quote, posthumous revenge of the Second International, end quote. Hostile to Marx's early works, it liquidated the overtly Hegelian heritage from Marxism and reimposed a mechanical materialism of the productive forces as unquestionable orthodoxy within the international communist movement. From 1938 onwards, this version of Marxism was enshrined in Stalin's book Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which was like a chapter in the short course on the history of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, Bolsheviks. I think that's the full title of it. I'm pretty sure it's a chapter from that book, which was to serve as a catechism for all communists. Therewith, Sartre reflected 20 years later, Marxism, quote, had come to a stop, end quote. Sartre. If this spurious and sclerotic doctrine was what counted as Marxist theory, it seemed an obvious and beneficial move to many Marxist intellectuals after Stalin's death to go back to the beginning, to the young Marx, to pose once more the question of Marx's relation to Hegel in the light of the newly available early works, to search for a Marxism shorn of its Cold War rigidities. The renewal of Marxism after a quarter of a century's virtual stagnation demanded drastic surgery. Redemption from Stalinized Marxism seemed to require one or all of revocation of any, quote, scientific, end quote, pretensions to scientificity, positive reevaluation of the young Marx, recasting of the whole of Marx's work along the lines of the early works, or alternatively, demotion of almost everything after the Communist Manifesto. At the very least, Engels had to go. In general, one can say that where the 1859 preface had been, there the 1844 manuscripts would be. Where once the centerpiece of Marxism had been the productive forces, now it was to be alienation, reification, and cognate themes. This philosophical strategy was accelerated by Khrushchev's critique of Stalinism's inhumanity and the subsequent cultural thaw. Quote, the thaw of the ice cap, writes Eric Hobsbawm, quote, watered the numerous plants of heterodoxy, schism, or mere unofficial growth which had survived on the margin of or under the giant glacier, end quote. Eric Hobsbawm, of course, being a lifelong member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. At least to my understanding, maybe it stopped after a while, but when everybody else, when his other British historians, say for instance, E.P. Thompson, who I believe left the Communist Party of Great Britain after the Hungarian invasion in 1956, Hobsbawm stayed. And he stayed after Afghanistan. He stayed after Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia preceding Afghanistan. But you get what I'm saying. You have to be cautious with him on left. From an anti-Stalinist perspective, you have to be cautious with Hobsbawm on his pronouncements about Marxism. By the early 1960s, the disposition of forces was clear: the young Marx against Stalin. The irony of theoretical history, according to Althusser, was that the Kautskyist-Stalinist rendition of Marxism and its intended rectification, the Hegelian, were in their conceptual structures at least mirror images. Briefly put, Althusser argued that in the Hegelian scheme of things, history is a process with a subject, man or the working class, and an end, communism. History is the journey of this subject and this subject's praxis through the triadic teleological structure of the Hegelian dialectic, or Marxist variation thereon, from original unity via self-estrangement to the eventual reappropriation of and reconciliation with the alienated human essence. Human liberation is the realization of a potential present at the origin. Economic evolutionism exhibits an analogous teleological structure, but with the productive forces occupying the central position and the, quote, negation of the negation, end quote, and or the, quote, transformation of quantity into quality, end quote, securing the transition from one mode of production to another, superior mode via the intermediary of the class struggle. In this schema, history is no longer the odyssey of humanity, but an epic of the productive forces, the linear progression in strict order of modes of production, wherein the potential of the productive forces developed by humanity is realized in the course of historical time within the integument of corresponding social forms. Communism is the appointed destination of history, the realm of material abundance and collective appropriation vouchsafed man by the forward march of the productive forces from primitive communism via class society to communism. It was the isomorphism of these otherwise quite distinct conceptions of historical materialism that supposedly facilitated their amalgamation. Each paradigm had two moments. Accrued economism and evolutionism were common to Kautskyism, Second International before the First World War, and Stalinism, the Third International after Lenin, alike. The second current, the reversion to, quote, Hegelianism, had been the route of, quote, positivism for the Western Marxist tradition and from Stalinist dogmatism for the class of 1956. There is, however, an important nuance to Althusser's position. Whereas the Hegelian Marxism of those he categorized as, quote, theoretical leftists and, quote, Lukács Korsch Gramsci had erred in a commendable political direction, its resurrection under any guise is retrograde, a, quote, rightist phenomenon. Whatever, neither schema, economism or historicism/humanism offered a viable basis for scrupulous scientific analysis. Whatever, neither schema, economism or historicism/humanism offered a viable basis for scrupulous scientific analysis of the real world, for an investigation and explanation of the complexities of concrete socio-historical processes, a theoretical demerit with practical political implications. Althusser's typology borders on travesty, assimilating as it does disparate figures in Western Marxism, Lukács Korsch and Gramsci, Sartre, Goldman, Della Volpe, and Coletti, to a single problematic of historicism derived from Hegel, reworked by Feuerbach and the young Marx, superseded in Marx's Capital, where Marx had criticized those errors of his youth to which his posterity had reverted. Indeed, Althusser's panorama of the contemporary scene bears a strong resemblance to the, quote, expressive totality, end quote, Althusser reprehended in the leading representatives of West European Marxism. Since one result of this is to obscure the novelty and merits of Althusser's own Marxism in relation to theirs, a few observations, inevitably cursory and simplistic, on the balance sheet of the great Western Marxist tradition at the point of Althusser's intervention are called for. Western Marxism originated in and was reproduced by a, quote, basic historical impasse, end quote, consequent upon the uniform pattern of revolutionary politics in Central and Western Europe after the First World War, defeat. Very schematically, in this complex history, four main moments can be identified. The first is the initiation of the tradition by Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci in the 1920s. Here it is perhaps legitimate to speak of a, quote, Hegelian Marxism, and not solely because all three attested to Hegel's centrality. In any event, contesting the Engels's legacy, their enterprises shared two basic features. One, in opposition to positivism, a historicism whereby Marxism was conceived not as a, quote, analytical science on the naturalist model, but rather as a revolutionary, dialectical ideology expressive of the proletariat's Weltanschauung, and two, in opposition to, quote, objectivism, a humanism wherein humanity's creative role in the practical constitution and transformation of the world was enhanced at the expense of economic determinism. The achievements of the founders were not of the same magnitude. Lukács's conjugation, in history and class consciousness, of Hegelianism and neo-Kantianism with the young Marxist problematic reinstated aspects of Marxist thought, repressed in official doctrine, above all the theories of commodity fetishism and alienation. I don't believe that the young Marx, and it depends, the pre-1844 Marx, I don't believe that he at all, his economic manuscripts had been published or resurfaced in like Marxog, had been assembled as part of his collected works, by the time that Lukács published History and Class Consciousness, which I believe was 1923. Lukács's conjugation in History and Class Consciousness of Hegelianism and neo-Kantianism with the young Marx is problematic, reinstated aspects of Marxist thought repressed in official doctrine, above all the theories of commodity fetishism and alienation. Yet for all that, it was a brilliant anticipation of the as-yet unpublished economic and philosophic manuscripts. Okay, yeah, that's right. It ultimately summed up a romantic anti-capitalism and anti-scientism, as politically voluntarist as it was philosophically speculative. By contrast, Gramsci's disdain for the, quote, imbecile complacency, end quote, of economic evolutionism and reconceptualization of Marxism as the, quote, philosophy of praxis, end quote, although informed by Crossean idealism, as in Benedetto Croce, I think that's his name, Benedetto, did not inhibit either highly significant, empirically substantiated conceptual departures, especially the theory of hegemony, or enormously suggestive concrete analyses of both past and present. Footnote: it is worth remarking here that prior to his discussion of Gramsci and reading Capital, Althusser, describing the Italian communist oeuvre as, quote, this enormously delicate and subtle work of genius, and, quote, expressed his fear that, quote, the reader may be drawn against my will to extend to Gramsci's fruitful discoveries in the field of historical materialism. In the field of historical materialism, the theoretical reservations I went to formulate with respect only to Gramsci's interpretation of dialectical materialism, end quote. Althusser in Reading Capital. Yeah. Which is on this channel, by the way. At least Althusser's contribution. Where am I? End footnote. Called to order by the Comintern, Lukács disavowed his work, mainly concentrating on the development of a Marxist theory of literature for the duration of the Stalinist freeze. Gramsci, meanwhile, fell victim not to the degeneration of the revolution in the East, but to fascist counter-revolution in the West. The second major episode in Western Marxism, not so much as alluded to by Althusser, bears the impress of this dark historical moment, the consolidation of Stalinism and the triumph of Nazism. Convinced that orthodox Marxism was incapable of explaining these disasters, key figures of the Frankfurt School, Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse, elaborated what can be loosely referred to as, quote, critical theory. Capitalism having undergone fundamental alteration in the intervening years, Marx's 19th century doctrine was no longer adequate for the analysis of modern history. A critique of advanced capitalist society geared to the prospect of human emancipation had, perforce, to draw on other theoretical traditions, whether philosophical such as Kant and Hegel, sociological, for example, Max Weber, or psychoanalytical, Freud. And its main focus was to shift from political economy to what for classical Marxism were, quote, superstructural, end quote, phenomena, in particular cultural forms and the ideologies underpinning and legitimating oppressive social relations. Among the positive aspects of this mutation in Marxism up to the early 1960s was an unparalleled flowering of aesthetics. Its negative features were also pronounced, however, if anything accentuating Lukácsian antipathies. The Frankfurt School tended to tended to a quietism and or pessimism in the face of a totalitarian capitalism pervaded by the, quote, instrumental rationality, end quote, characteristic of the natural sciences and the, quote, mass deception, end quote, practiced successfully by the, quote, culture industry, end quote. For what Adorno and his colleagues precisely lacked, of course, was their Hungarian predecessors' confidence in the proletariat as a potential agent of revolutionary redemption. Perceiving no substitute for it, critical theory did indeed, quote, remain negative, end quote, persisting with the, quote, great refusal, end quote, from a philosophical standpoint of those of whose practical realization it despaired. Footnote. See the conclusion to Marcuse 1964. Adorno's philosophical masterpiece, Negative Dialectics, which is on this channel, was published in 1966. The ambitious reconstruction of Frankfurt Marxism was undertaken by Jürgen Habermas, likewise largely postdates Althusser's principal work. I think you could say Habermas is anti-Marxism, but that's just me. Exile in America and residence in the Federal Republic of Germany were perhaps hardly conducive to anything other than such pessimism of intelligence and will. In France, on the other hand, a strong communist tradition had survived the war unbroken, thereafter buttressing a politically engaged, independent Marxism critical of it. Just as a side note, they were pessimistic. It wasn't just because they were isolated and stuff. They were the Frankfurt School, if anything, was definitely anti-Stalinist. Therefore, they didn't have the kind of naive optimism of many who did not have a critical examination of Stalinism at all. It was here that the next chapter in Western Marxist history was written. The attempted synthesis of Marxism and existentialism, primarily associated with Sartre. Prior to the war, communists such as Henri Lefebvre and Auguste Cornu had begun to remedy the shallowness of Gallic Marxist culture. Lefebvre's initiative, however, issued in a humanist recasting of Marxism, which was already suspect in the PCF in the 1930s. With Nizan dead at Dunkirk, Pulitzer murdered by the Nazis, Lefebvre effectively neutralized, and Zdanovism domesticated, creative Marxist work in the post-war years migrated to the existentialist milieu, operating on the PCF's left flank. What about Socialisme ou Barbarie, which was very important in the 1950s, at least theoretically, and was influential on the Situationist and on 68 in general, and Daniel Cohn-Bendit. Philosophically, of Heideggerian and Husserlian formation, Sartre and his colleagues' transition to Marxism was mediated by Kojève's influential interpretation of Hegel. For them, capital was not only the culmination of the Paris manuscripts, but a, quote, concrete phenomenology of mind, inseparably concerned with the work of the economy and the realization of man, end quote. Merleau-Ponty. The eventual landmark of the projected Marxist existentialist synthesis was to be Sartre's book, Critique of Dialectical Reason, an implicit response to the Merleau-Pontian challenge in which he sought to furnish the, quote, living Marxism, end quote, he had earlier invoked against communist doctrine. Sartre. A product of the history it sought to render intelligible, Marxism was, quote, the untranscendable philosophy of our time, end quote, and dialectical reason the, quote, ideology of the rising class, end quote. Sartre. Under Stalinism, however, theory and practice had been sundered, the latter degenerating into pragmatism, the former into dogmatism. Thus, there was a link between the fate of the Russian Revolution, the current impasse of the Western Communist parties, and the sclerosis of Marxist theory. Theoretical Stalinism was condemned on two main scores: for its economic determinist account of the historical process, which negated the specificity of human history, suppressing its complexity and the role of creative human agency therein, and for its conception of Marxism as a natural science, which betrayed its dialectical particularity, severing theory from lived experience. If Stalin had carried this to the point of paroxysm, Engels' dialectic of nature, projected onto history, was the source of the theoretical debacle. Therefore, it was not simply a matter of clearing away the Stalinist detritus in order to recover pure Marxism. Since there was ample warrant for such constructions, Marxism had to be reconstructed as a theory of human self-emancipation, in which its, quote, first truth, end quote, that, quote, men make history, end quote, was restored to it. The details of this remarkable endeavor cannot detain us here, but the outcome of Sartre's intricate analysis of the, quote, elementary formal structures, end quote, of any possible history, the transhistorical mechanisms underlying the formation and transformation of, quote, practical ensembles, end quote, human groups, might roughly be summarized thus. The critiques problematic of the dialectic of praxis and scarcity establish the open-endedness of the historical process, denying the ineluctability of socialism, and provides a fertile set of categories for the investigation of state, class, and party, hence of the history made in Marxism's name. Yet despite the historicization of the concepts of being and nothingness, yet despite being the historicization of the concepts of being and nothingness, it essays, the critique remains imprisoned in an ontology of mind and matter, self and other, history and nature, whereby alienation is effectively equated with social structure, Marxism subsumed into existentialism, communism precluded by the inexorable logic of scarcity. Accordingly, it is the less surprising that the promised second volume, which was to ascend from the abstract to the concrete, was abandoned. For the Sartrean attempt to found the, quote, intelligibility of history, end quote, on individual praxis had precisely the opposite effect, rendering it unintelligible, unless, that is, resort was made to an illegitimate device, totalization with a totalizer. Sartre's work was written against the backdrop of sanguinary counterinsurgency in Algeria and the rise of the right at home, a conjuncture of political emergency in which his dismay at the PCF's ghettoization found powerful expression. Like other French Marxist intellectuals, Sartre would contrast with its stasis the relative dynamism of an Italian communism now appropriating the Gramscian legacy in support of its strategy for a national road to socialism. The fourth main current in Western Marxism, the Della Volpian school inside the Communist Party of Italy, went against the grain of its party's orthodoxy. Gaetano della Volpe and his disciples in the front rank, Coletti and Pietranera, were uncompromisingly anti-Hegelian, emphatically reasserting the complete rupture between Marx's work and Hegelian philosophy, the scientificity of Marxism, the paramountcy of capital. Moreover, they made no secret of their sympathy for Lenin's political positions and philosophical thought. In the charter of this vindication of the classical tradition, the book Logic as a Positive Science, published in 1950, I didn't know that was that early, Della Volpe sought to cast historical materialism as a, quote, moral Galileanism, as in Galileo, end quote, a scientific materialist sociology based upon the young Marxist critique of Hegel's, quote, delirium logicum, end quote, and graduation from, quote, hypostasis to hypothesis, from a priori assertions to experimental forecast, end quote. Della Volpe. Whatever its author's temperament, at the hands of his followers, Della Volpe's epistemological mediation was not lacking in political implications inconsistent with the PCI's cautious perspective on Italian state and society, as the controversies of the late 1950s and early 1960s were to demonstrate. But, to restrict ourselves to the theoretical level, three conclusions on the record of this professedly scientific Marxism by the mid-1960s, namely prior to Coletti's major work, suggest themselves. Meticulous readers of the Marxist canon, the Della Volpians offered no major additions to or modifications of the corpus, satisfied in the first instance to reclaim it from contemporary distortion or revision. Next, the account of the hypothetico-deductive modality of social science, however sophisticated compared with communist orthodoxy and commendable in a hitherto tenaciously anti-scientific Western tradition, was naturalist in the extreme. Finally, an undifferentiated concept of science was complemented by a continuous conception of its history, yielding, for example, an undiscriminating view of Marxist thought as a linear progression from the early works to capital. Althusser was to refer to Della Volpe as having, quote, set out on the same path, end quote, as Althusser, and in 1965 noted the similarities and differences between their respective enterprises. Althusserian and Delavolpian Marxism both represented counter-idealist trends in Western Marxism, at once irreconcilably hostile to Hegelianism and vehemently affirmative of Marxism's scientific status, yet they were nevertheless distinct. Locating Marx's rupture with Hegel virtually at the outset of his career, in the introduction to the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Della Volpe et al. Accepted the Marxist credentials of the early works, with serious historicist consequences, so Althusser suggested, further interpretation of Marxist science and philosophy. There's a footnote that I missed. Footnote: it should be said that neither Della Volpe nor Coletti reciprocated Althusser's high estimation. In footnote. End footnote. Footnote. There's another footnote. In Althusser and Balibar, so that's reading capital, Althusser even conflates Coletti with Gramsci as an exponent of, quote, absolute historicism, end quote, a confusion which he later confessed to be such. End footnote. What then was the differentia specifica of Althusser's project within Western Marxism? Over and above his repudiation of Hegel and the young Marx and endorsement in their place of the mature Marx, Lenin, and Mao, it might approximately be defined as follows. According to Althusser, with the exception of the Delavolpians, the various schools of Western Marxism negated, quote, what is specific to the sciences, the production of objective knowledge, end quote. Althusser. They did so in their different ways, either by treating the natural sciences as bourgeois and Marxism as proletarian science, or by sharply distinguishing the natural from the human and social sciences. In each case, however, the result was the same: relativism, and hence a, quote, relativization of historical materialism and consequent attenuation of its scientificity. Contra the anti-naturalist currents, the natural sciences were cognitively autonomous sciences independent of class subjects, and there existed no distinction between them and social science, Marxism for Althusser. In terms of the relative dignity of their results, objective knowledge of their respective objects. Thus, historical materialism, the science of social formations and their transformations, was a science, quote, among others, end quote. But contra the Delavolpian current, the, quote, unity of scientificity, end quote, was of an epistemological, not a methodological character. So if Althusserianism was not unique in campaigning against the misconception of science, majoritarian in Western Marxism, it was distinguished by its particular anti-empiricist conception of the sciences, as opposed to the notion of general scientific method, to which, in the Delavolpian setup, the sciences must conform to merit the stamp of scientificity. In other words, whilst the anti-naturalists compromised the scientificity of Marxism, while the anti-naturalists compromised the scientificity of Marxism in the act of vindicating its autonomy, the Italian naturalists compromised its autonomy in the act of vindicating its scientificity, rendering it conformable to a misconceived neo-positivist model of the natural sciences. For Althusser, by contrast, historical materialism was both scientific and autonomous, governed like the natural sciences solely by the exigencies of the pursuit of objective knowledge, yet possessing its own theory, method, and object. Western Marxism had originated in an impasse. Althusser's singularity within it was that he sought to break the impasse, to put substance back into the revolutionary project in the West via a revindication of scientific Marxism from its positivist parody or misrepresentation by both orthodoxy and heterodoxy. Kautskyism or Stalinism were not the inevitable price to be paid for historical materialism being genuinely scientific. Althusser concurred with Sartre's judgment that, quote, the Marxist universe was full of deserts and unexplored lands, end quote, but differed on the means of remedying this situation. Theoretical de-Stalinization must not surrender the critical instrument potentially capable of reanimating revolutionary politics to its Stalinization, but on the contrary reclaim and develop it. Part nonetheless of the tradition he criticized, Althusser, as we shall see, also compromised historical materialism. Althusser did so as a result of his assimilation into Marxism of the two intellectual traditions to which, by his own admission, he turned in an attempt to force an exit from the crisis of Marxism. The first of these was that what he later described as a, quote, certain French materialist tradition of rationalism, parenthesis, that of Bachelard Canguilhem, end quote. A tradition whose conventionalism and, quote, historical epistemology, end quote, it has been suggested must ultimately trace back to Auguste Comte. Footnote. See Dew's Outstanding 1994. Althusser's references to Comte, though fewer and far between, are uniformly laudatory. Thus in Althusser, 1969, Comte is described as, quote, the only mind worthy of interest, end quote, in French philosophy from the 1789 revolution down to the 1920s, and in Althusser 1971 is a, quote, great mind, while in Althusser and Balibar 1970 he is credited with having, quote, often come very close, end quote, to the concept of a scientific problematic. Althusser accepted that his, quote, emphasis on the sciences, end quote, owed something to the, quote, French cultural tradition, to its, quote, enlightenment. The precise Comtean connection here would make an interesting subject for further research. End footnote. And the second, in significant respects compatible with a French epistemological tradition characterized by its prioritization of theory over experience, was the rationalist philosophy of Spinoza, with its total differentiation between rational knowledge and, quote, opinion, or, quote, imagination derived from random sense experience. Footnote. Althusser's discussion of his Detour via Spinoza, intimated in the book For Marx and the book Reading Capital, can be found in Althusser 1976. End footnote. Quote, people always situate themselves in relation to someone, end quote. Althusser confided in the Société Française de Philosophie in 1968. Quote, but my reference point would be neither Kant nor Hegel, it would be Spinoza. I'm a Spinozist, end quote. Althusser. The details of Althusser's affiliations and their consequences for both Althusser's construction of a Marxist epistemology and his reconstruction of historical materialism will occupy us later, but for better or worse, it is they that determined the distinctive shape assumed by epistemological anti-empiricism and social scientific anti-historicism, anti-humanism, and anti-economism, which determined, in short, the specificity of Althusserian Marxism. However unsatisfactory Althusser's treatment of his peers remains, we can now at least see something of its logic and thus understand why for him the end of dogmatism had not issued in the restoration of Marxism. The contemporary rediscovery and repetition of pre-Stalinist initiatives was a false trail. The current theoretical poverty of the Communist Party of France was moreover held to be compounded by a specifically, quote, French misery, end quote, the stubborn, profound absence of any real theoretical culture in the history of the French workers' movement, end quote. Althusser. Founded at a time when the influence of pre-Marxist ideologies on the French labor movement was still strong, the PCF had further suffered from, quote, the burden of a long century of official philosophical stupidity, end quote, in the national, quote, provincialist, end quote, culture. Born into a, quote, theoretical vacuum, end quote, the party had produced no philosophical, quote, masters. Footnote, as we have seen, only Comte was exempted from Althusser's censor. In Althusser 1971, Durkheim was added to what can scarcely be called a list. End footnote. Footnote. In Althusser 1969a, which I don't know what that is, Althusser judges the great Germanist and historian of Marxism, Auguste Cornu, quote, the only name fit for displaying upon our frontiers, end quote. Auguste Cornu was like a French Marx scholar, I'm pretty sure a Stalinist Marx scholar, who moved to East Germany after World War II. End footnote. Before it could, the, quote, dogmatist night, end quote, had descended. Indoctrination, not research, became the order of the day. Independent spirits were either marginalized, such as Lefebvre, or put to work in party schools, Pulitzer. With Zhdanovism, the, quote, primacy of politics, end quote, that had always characterized the French communist tradition, to the detriment of theory, reappeared in particularly aberrant form. Althusser's adherence to the Communist Party of France coincided with the pronouncement of the ultra-leftist line of the, quote, two sciences, end quote, which ushered in an era of, quote, theoretical monstrosity, end quote, when psychoanalysis was a, quote, cosmopolitan, quote, reactionary ideology, end quote, relativity theory relativist, quote, epigons of bourgeois music, end quote, dangerous elements, and when Stalin, quote, great father of the peoples, end quote, doubled up as the, quote, highest scientific authority in the world, end quote. In circumstances as inclement as these, a Marxist who was also trying to be a Marxist in philosophy could not even invoke the precedent of Marx and Engels in the German ideology, and abandon philosophy's abstract speculation for the concrete knowledge promised by the empirical science of history. Nor could he attempt to work out a version of the, quote, logic Marx had never written. Despite the, quote, long night of theory, end quote, the only possible course for a communist philosopher was to work within the parameters of, quote, diamat, as inflected by Stalin, while looking over his shoulder at the control commission. Footnote: It should be noted that in addition to loyally promoting Soviet fashions, Zhdanovism, Lysenkoism, etc., the PCF's leadership was responsible in this era for some theoretical aberrations of its own. For example, Thérèse's thesis of the, quote, absolute pauperization, end quote, of the proletariat in post-war France. End footnote. It was a time for automatic loyalty to the oscillating party line. The alternative was expulsion and denunciation. The Communist Party of France was second to none in the vigor with which it prosecuted the ideological Cold War inside as well as outside the party. 30 years later, Althusser recalled that there had been, quote, real, quote, Moscow trials, end quote, right here in France, end quote. Footnote: see Claudin, 1975, for some details and testimony. A minor example of the genre never mentioned by him apparently concerned Althusser himself. In his memoirs, the historian and former communist Emmanuel Ladurie relates that during this period he and others were ordered by high-ranking party officials to instruct Althusser to sever relations with his companion, Helene Reutemann, who had already been expelled from the PCF under suspicion of Trotskyist sympathies. See Ladurie, where 1982, where Althusser's, quote, great dignity, end quote, amidst, quote, intolerable ideological and moral pressure, end quote, is recalled. End footnote. Althusser had to endure Stalin's, quote, implacable rule, end quote, over the PCF for only 5 years. That they, and this whole tempestuous period, left their marks is obvious to anyone who reads the, quote, autobiographical, end quote, pages with which 4 Marx opens. That's on this channel. As the moving introduction, quote, today, indicates, quote, Stalinist dogmatism, end quote, for Althusser meant above all this, the degeneration of Marxism into a set of, quote, famous quotations, end quote, which party intellectuals were obliged on pain of inquisition to reproduce. Quote, what then counted as philosophy, end quote, Althusser wrote, quote, could only choose between commentary and silence, between conviction, whether inspired or forced, and dumb embarrassment, end quote. Althusser traces the pliancy of many communist intellectuals like himself to the fact that, quote, the intellectuals of petty bourgeois origin who came to the party at that time felt that they had to pay in pure activity, if not in political activism, the imaginary debt they thought they had contracted by not being proletarian, end quote, Althusser. And again, that's on this channel. Silence would appear to have been Althusser's course. When Althusser broke it in the early 1960s, it was scarcely to perform the functions traditionally expected of its intellectuals by the PCF. Justification of the party's political line, illustration of the, quote, Marxist method, end quote, in their specialist domains, bestowal of prestige on the party by their allegiance. Althusser challenged the very definition of, quote, method. Althusser did not propagandize on behalf of the, quote, line. Althusser lent such prestige as he had to independent theoretical research. As Rancière points out, The very idea of a, quote, return to Marx, end quote, was suspect to Althusser's seniors, implying as it did a source of authority outside the party, or rather its leadership. And indeed, such a project signified not only a rereading of Marx's work, but a suspension of belief in the authorities and patented intellectuals who guarded the tablets on which successive orthodoxies were inscribed. Extraordinary as it may seem, there is little doubt that Althusser traced many of the vicissitudes of communism after Lenin to lacunae in and infidelities to Marxist theory. Absence of, or wrong, theory was the root of evils. Against humanist Marxism, Althusser insisted that Marx and Engels' worthy ambition had been to found a scientific socialism, a socialism that superseded its utopian predecessors or contemporaries by its attention to preconditions, means, and goals. Quote, Marxists know, end quote, he concluded, quote, quote, Marxists know, Althusser concluded the article, Marxism and Humanism, quote, that there can be no tactics that do not depend on a strategy, and no strategy that does not depend on theory, end quote. Althusser. Addressing, quote, burning questions of our movement, end quote, in 1902, Lenin had asserted that, quote, without revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement. Citing Lenin's approval, Althusser added that the theory in question was historical materialism, quote, the Marxist science of the development of social formations, end quote. Althusser. In principle, possession of it distinguished the Communist Party's vanguards of their respective proletariats from their social democratic rivals. The problem 60 years on from Lenin's injunction was that Marxist theory had scarcely developed since him, largely owing to, quote, the conditions in which the international working class movement was enmeshed by the politics of the, quote, cult, bracket, of personality, end bracket, by its countless victims in the ranks of very valuable militants, intellectuals, and scientists, by the ravages inflicted by dogmatism on the intellect. For many years, it literally sacrificed and blocked all development of Marxist-Leninist theory, end quote. Althusser. The great opportunity afforded by Khrushchev's, quote, liberalization, end quote, was that it had introduced a, quote, real freedom of investigation, end quote, which must not be squandered. It was being squandered, but if the new era had not, quote, restored Marxist philosophy to us in its integrity, end quote, there was an additional reason, quote, the end of dogmatism puts us face to face with this reality, that Marxist philosophy, has still largely to be constituted, that the theoretical difficulties we debated in the dogmatist night were not completely artificial, rather they were largely the result of a meagerly elaborated Marxist philosophy. Or better, that in the rigid caricatural forms we suffered or maintained, including the theoretical monstrosity of the two sciences, something of an unsettled problem was really present in grotesque and blind forms, and finally, that our lot and our duty today is quite simply to pose and confront these problems in the light of day, if Marxist philosophy is to acquire some real existence or achieve a little theoretical consistency, end quote. Althusser. Reminiscence of Marxist philosophy was impossible, since he had never elaborated the Marxist philosophy or epistemology initiated with the foundation of historical materialism, and which rendered apodictic the veridical nature of that theoretical discourse. He had not produced the, quote, logic, which has preoccupied Marxist philosophers ever since. His reflections in the postface to the second edition of Capital were problematic, and Engels' late works no substitute. If Leninism had to be extricated from Stalinism, Marx had to be retrieved from, some of, Engels. So Althusser could not simply lay hold of the authentic Marxist discourse on method, employ it as a touchstone, and condemn other Marxists for infidelity to its principles. 80 years after the death of Marx, his followers are confronted by, quote, the essential question, irresistibly drawn from us even by our trials, failures, and impotence. What is Marxist philosophy? Has Marxist philosophy any theoretical right to existence? And if it does in principle, how can its specificity be defined? Has it any theoretical right to existence? And if it does exist in principle, how can Marxist philosophy's specificity be defined? End quote. Marx. Althusser. Jesus Christ. Althusser. What was to be done? Althusser's program in the books For Marx and Reading Capital is twofold: to construct an authentically non-empiricist Marxist philosophy, in accordance with tradition, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, and to reconstruct Marxist science, quote, historical materialism, end quote, in non-economistic, non-humanist, and non-historicist form. The provision of a philosophy was the prime desideratum, because it could prevent a repetition of the Zhdanovist delirium. It would act as a bulwark against other kinds of theoretical pragmatism, and it would provide an epistemological foundation and guarantee for historical materialism, thus defending historical materialism against the enemy within and without the gates. If there were difficulties in the path of this program, there were also resources, for as Lenin had discovered, Marx had bequeathed the, quote, logic of capital, end quote. The book, Capital, end quote, Lenin. Marxist philosophy and the Marxist philosophy, the underwriter of Marxist science and its development, was present in the, quote, practical state, end quote, in Marx's great scientific work. His science was, as it were, epistemology in action, but it had to be extracted and cast in rigorous theoretical form, rendered explicit so that the development of historical materialism proceeded along the right lines. Mission accomplished. Dialectical materialism would verify the scientificity of historical materialism, superintend extensions of it, and represent it thereafter in the theoretical Kampfplatz. The available theoretical resources were to be supplemented by the, quote, practical works, unquote, of Marxism. For example, the Russian and Chinese revolutions, which also contained latent theoretical elements available for extraction. Since Marx's political practice was potentially in advance of theory, this operation was an urgent task. Footnote. For a summary of these, quote, difficulties and resources, end quote, of contemporary Marxist theoretical work, see Althusser, 1990. In Reading Capital, Althusser refers to quote, the, quote, reading of those new works of Marxism which, contain in them something essential to the future of Marxism, what Marxism is producing in the vanguard countries of the, quote, third world, end quote, which is struggling for its freedom from the guerrillas of Vietnam to Cuba, end quote. Althusser. Marxist science and politics alike represented, quote, a theoretical revolution in action, end quote. For the sake of that science and those politics, Marxist philosophy must become contemporary with them. New section, the French ideology. Althusser's, quote, return to Marx, end quote, he reflected a decade later, quote, did have something original about it, in the fact that it criticized dogmatism not from the right-wing positions of humanist ideology, but from the left-wing positions of theoretical anti-humanism, anti-empiricism, and anti-economism, We were attempting to give back to Marx's theory, to give back to Marx's theory, which had been treated by dogmatism and by Marxist humanism as the first available ideology, something of its status as a theory, a revolutionary theory, end quote. Althusser. Althusser's theoretical predilections may have gone against the grain of contemporary French Marxism, but they were in conformity with the national philosophical culture. For in France at the turn of the 1950s, the sun of Hegelian Marxism was no sooner rising than it was setting. Althusser was only one of a generation of intellectuals in that epoch, quote, trying to escape Hegel, end quote, in his case paradoxically via Marx. At the very moment when Marxists were rediscovering the young Marx and reevaluating his Hegelian roots, a major transition in French philosophy was in progress. The passage from, quote, phenomenology to, quote, structuralism, more broadly from the legacy of the three H's, Husserl, Heidegger, to that of the three, quote, masters of suspicion, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud. Footnote. The phrase, quote, masters of suspicion, end quote, is likewise Foucault's and dates from 1964. End footnote. The astonishing rise to paramountcy of structuralism can be dated from the second half of the 1950s. In 1957, Roland Barthes' Virtuoso Mythologies, the book, appeared, indexing everything from soap powder to steak and chips, from Garbo's face to Einstein's brain, to the domain of semiology. More important philosophically was the publication the following year of Claude Lévi-Strauss's collection of essays, Structural Anthropology, titled Structural Anthropology. In it, taking Lévi-Strauss's cue from a remark of Saussure's, Lévi-Strauss conjectured that all social practices were symbolic and hence susceptible to semiotic treatment. If remodeled along the lines of Saussure and Trubetskoy's revolutions in linguistics, the social and human sciences could cross the threshold of scientificity. When Lévi-Strauss did what Lévi-Strauss did for anthropology and the study of myths, others attempted for literature, Barthes, cinema, Christian Metz, fashion, Barthes again, and so on. In Barthes' book, Elements of Semiology, published in 1964, Barthes noted, quote, a kind of demand, end quote, for the new doctrine. Barthes and his colleagues sought to assuage it. The philosopher's stone of the human sciences, long in quest of scientific status, had apparently been discovered. In reality, the French ideology had been born. The challenge to pre- or post-Stalinist constructions of historical materialism, implicit in the new paradigm, became explicit with Lévi-Strauss's book, The Savage Mind. The Savage Mind's final chapter, titled History and Dialectic, launched a frontal attack on Sartre's book, Critique of Dialectical Reason, and its proposal for a, quote, concrete anthropology, end quote. Quote, Marxism ought to study real men in depth, not dissolve men in a bath of sulfuric acid, end quote, Sartre had written in Search for a Method. Quote, I believe the ultimate goal of the human sciences to be not to constitute, but to dissolve man, end quote, retorted Lévi-Strauss, who nevertheless described Marxism as his, quote, point of departure, end quote. Sartre, Lévi-Strauss argued, had remained a Cartesian, commencing with, and forever after being ensnared by, the actor's conscious project. He had eluded cultural and historical relativism mainly by illegitimately interpreting past forms from the standpoint of the Western present, thus erasing real historical discontinuity and a spurious continuity. Sartre's anthropocentric history and subjectivist epistemology were alike ideological, the former a modern myth, the latter a perennial illusion. Ethnocentric dialectical reason and contingent historical diachrony were inimical to scientificity. Thus Sartre had discovered in historicity, quote, the last refuge of a transcendental humanism, end quote. Lévi-Strauss. The problem of the relations between structures and subjects, which had preoccupied and divided Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, demanded a scientific, not a philosophical answer. Structural anthropology, considered by Lévi-Strauss at least to be a, quote, hard science, was the requisite research program. Quote, structural thought now defends the cause of materialism, end quote, Lévi-Strauss would claim 2 years later in the, quote, in the piece Overture to his masterpiece Mythologique is probably actually said. History, all too dependent on human subjectivity and vitiated by Eurocentric evolutionism, was its epistemological antithesis. While Lévi-Strauss sought to, quote, escape Hegel, end quote, via Saussure, the same year, in a portent of the future, Gilles Deleuze made the identical bid via Nietzsche. Deleuze's Nietzschean philosophy impugned dialectical thought of any Hegelian inspiration or affiliation. The hero of Michel Foucault's, quote, Structuralist, and, quote, book, The Order of Things, written contemporaneously with Reading Capital, but published the following year, was likewise Nietzsche. He it was who, quote, burned for us even before we were born the intermingled promises of the dialectic and anthropology, end quote, offering, quote, as both promise and task, end quote, the death of man, end quote. Foucault announced in the course of a critique of the historicist, quote, episteme, to which he allocated Marxism. Quote, humanism and, quote, historicism were thus under attack from many sides, whether in the name of the Swiss linguist or the German philosopher. They were being invited to vacate the privileged position they had allegedly hitherto occupied in Western thought. Historical materialism, identified with them and deemed similarly archaic, was in the dock. In the hectic world of Parisian philosophical fashion, Marxism a la Sartre, Lefebvre, or Goldman, let alone Girardi, with its, quote, subject-centered history and subject-constituted knowledge, end quote, Benton, was rapidly eclipsed. Man's end was anticipated. History was a myth. Sartrean Marxism, its highest stage. Footnote. Sartre offered no considered response to the ascendant paradigm, displaying instead sheer exasperation. See Sartre 1966 for a violent attack on Foucault. Sartre's comments on Althusser, by contrast, are surprisingly moderate. See Sartre 1966. End footnote. The audacity and perilousness of Althusser's initiative can now perhaps be better appreciated. In order to escape Hegel and rescue Marxism from the discredit into which it was apparently falling by association with him, Althusser carried out an adroit reversal of alliances, perceiving a convergence between the astringent anti-humanism of structuralism and his own Marxist positions. Althusser informed the Italian communist newspaper Rinascita in 1964 that Levi-Strauss was more of an immediate ally of historical materialism than Sartre. Footnote. It should be noted, however, that Althusser was far from uncritical of structuralism in these texts. If it was valid in linguistics and partially so in anthropology, it was invalid outside these domains, ideological and hence incapable of furnishing a scientific interpretation of the world. Only Marxism could offer this. Umberto Eco's particular appropriation of it for historical materialism led not to the renewal of Marxism, but to its, quote, theoretical liquidation, end quote. In a text published the previous summer, titled Philosophy and the Human Sciences, questioning whether, quote, the disciplines which present themselves under the label of, quote, human sciences are not only genuinely human, but also and above all truly sciences, end quote. Althusser had signaled his opposition both to a retreating humanism and to an advancing technocratism. Among those criticized were, quote, philosophers like Levi-Strauss, parenthesis, I'm not referring to his admirable concrete analyses, but to the, quote, philosophy, end quote, attached to them, end parenthesis, who have discovered the means, the dream of every bricoleur, of holding together into the ontology of binarism, avant-garde linguistics, information theory, mathematics, and physics. Marx, Freud, Goldstein, Comte, and the exchange of words, women, and goods, von Neumann, the shamans, and Lacan, Rousseau, and the ethnologist himself, ... All these, quote, philosophers, ... produce what they consider, ... to be philosophy, but which is a philosophy fiction, which is merely the point d'honneur of technocratic thinking, end quote. An accompanying footnote was even more damning, or, quote, vulgarized structuralism, end quote. Quote, an appropriate manipulation of metonymy and metaphor, for example, of paradigm and syntagm, etc., provides ... rapid and astonishing results. Some have already been published, others will soon follow. A huge expansion of structuralist output is already foreseeable. It panders ... to the taste for rapid results, end quote. Quite the reverse of the mere, quote, flirt. Quite the reverse of the mere, quote, flirt with structuralist terminology, end quote, to which Althusser reduced this episode in his later autocritique. Althusser's Théorie politique dictated something approaching what Nikos Poulantzas would describe as an alliance with, quote, structuralism against historicism, Levi-Strauss against Sartre, end quote. Thus, if Althusser simultaneously opposed phenomenological anti-naturalism and vindicated, contra Levi-Strauss, the project of a science of history, in the article Marxism and Humanism, without referring to the savage mind, he gave his imprimatur to the new theme of the, quote, end of man, end quote, and explained the reasons for his acquiescence. Quote, strictly in respect to theory, one can and must speak openly of Marx's theoretical anti-humanism, and see in this theoretical anti-humanism the absolute negative precondition of the positive knowledge of the human world itself, and of its practical transformation. It is impossible to know anything about men except on the absolute precondition that the philosophical, theoretical myth of man is reduced to ashes. So any thought that appeals to Marx for any kind of restoration of a theoretical anthropology of humanism is no more than ashes theoretically, but in practice it could pile up a monument of pre-Marxist ideology that would weigh down on real history and threaten to lead it into blind alleys, end quote. Althusser. For Althusser, Sartre was of the devil's party without knowing it. Both Merleau-Ponty and Levi-Strauss had identified Sartre's Cartesianism as what separated Sartre from Marxism and or materialism. This appears to have been the burden of Althusser's intervention following a lecture by Sartre at the École Normale Supérieure shortly after the publication of his book Critique of Dialectical Reason. Reportedly finding the accusation of having resurrected the cogito in the shape of a philosophy of praxis incomprehensible, Sartre failed to counter it. Sartre's consternation possibly decided the philosophical allegiances of a generation of French Marxist intellectuals. At any rate, thereafter, Althusser pursued this line of attack, contending that Sartre's epistemological starting point in individual human agency led only to a regression to infinity, which left him quite incapable of explaining history. Men were not the constitutive subjects of history, but constituted subjects in history, agents subsumed under and allotted their places/functions by a set of social structures, economic, political, and ideological, interior and exterior to them, governed by their own peculiar laws. History was a, quote, process without a subject, end quote, which only a science disjunct from the consciousness and illusions of human subjects could illuminate, thereby enabling its transformation and their liberation. Reading Capital, it has justly been said, is the book Reading Capital. It has been justly said is a, quote, anti-critique of dialectical reason, end quote. And that quote's from someone named Cotton. Althusser then believed that the cause of Marxist materialism could best be defended in the early 1960s in conjunction with aspects of structuralism. That Althusser turned to contemporary French philosophy as well as to the Marxist classics for aid in the construction of a post-Stalinist Marxism is readily apparent from the affiliations Althusser announced to Lacan's anti-humanist reading of Freud and especially to Bachelardian, quote, historical epistemology, end quote. While Althusser was proposing a return to Marx, Lacan was conducting a return to Freud. In an essay dating from 1964 titled Freud and Lacan, which reopened the dialogue between Marxism and psychoanalysis proscribed by Zhdannovism, Althusser endorsed both Lacan's construction of Freud and his representation of it as a rejoinder to revisionism. Repeating an analogy already drawn by Freud and his French disciple, he concluded by making the same bid for Marxism, quote, not in vain did Freud sometimes compare the critical reception of his discovery with the upheavals of the Copernican revolution. Since Copernicus, we have known that the earth is not the, quote, center of the universe. Since Marx, we have known that the human subject, the economic, political, or philosophical ego, is not the, quote, center of history, and even in opposition to the philosophers of Enlightenment and to Hegel, that history has no, quote, center, but possesses a structure which is no necessary, quote, center, except in ideological misrecognition. In turn, Freud has discovered for us that the real subject, the individual in the individual's unique essence, has not the form of an ego centered on the, quote, ego, on, quote, consciousness, or on, quote, existence, that the human subject is decentered, constituted by a structure which is no, quote, center either, except in the imaginary misrecognition of the, quote, ego, i.e. the ideological formations in which it, quote, recognizes itself, end quote. Althusser. Footnote: Althusser's article, published in La Nouvelle Critique in 1964, came 15 years after the appearance of the article Le psychanalyse une idéologie réactionnaire in the same journal. Reprinting it in 1976, he noted that in 1964, psychoanalysis was still not, quote, in good odor, end quote, among communists. I don't know. The part played by Althusser in the enhancement of psychoanalysis in France, whether via his invitation to Lacan to conduct his seminar at the École Normale or his pioneering essay, is justly highlighted by Rudinesco in her 1986 book. Unlike Levi-Strauss, who is reported not to have read For Marx or Reading Capital, on one occasion at least, Lacan reciprocated the interest shown by Althusser in his work. In Figaro Littéraire of the 29th of December 1966, Lacan stated his conviction that Althusser's, quote, division of Marxist thought may be taken as definitive, end quote. Lacan. End footnote. Althusser had already utilized Lacanian psychoanalysis for the theory of ideology proposed in the article Marxism and Humanism. As we shall see, would have further recourse to it. Althusser evidently believed Lacan's project vis-a-vis Freud to coalesce with his own. As Michel Pichou once remarked, something approaching a, quote, triple alliance was hereafter concluded between Althusserian Marxism, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and Saussurean linguistics. At all events, the two non-Marxist discourses made the Althusserian grade. They did so according to the norms of an epistemology derived in large part from the French philosopher of science Gaston Bachelard. Whilst Althusser entered into an alliance of convenience with Levi-Strauss and one of principle with Lacan, his rapprochement with Bachelardian epistemology and historiography was central to his enterprise, where his aspiration was to demonstrate that Marxism, in reality as well as principle, is the science of history and a science, quote, like the others, end quote, on an epistemological par with its, quote, royal, end quote, confrères, or confrère, I don't know. And Althusser aimed to do that by the simultaneous construction/application of Marxist philosophy. Althusser's version of the latter was in fact to be a transformed Marxist-Bachelardian epistemology combined with certain Spinozist and structuralist theses and with elements of Marx's own reflections. The latter were drawn from the 1857 introduction, which supplied a canonical blessing for the union of the classical and the contemporary. It would be an anti-empiricist epistemology, a, quote, theory of the production of knowledges, end quote, one whose, quote, central thesis would be the opposition of consciousness and concept, end quote. Decombe, 1981. The classical expression of this antithesis for Althusser would have been Caville, 1960, or Caville, or Cavaille. I have no idea. End footnote. Bachelard's, quote, rational materialism, end quote, had been forced to represent and defend the revolutionary novelty of modern physics and chemistry. If historical materialism was submitted to a rigorous Bachelardian reading by the deployment of two sets of concepts, science/ideology, Marxist, and problematic/epistemological break, Bachelardian, and passed the audition, it would simultaneously be rendered proof against philosophical threats and elevated to the promised land of plain science. Althusser put the encounter between Bachelardian epistemology and his own effort to elaborate a Marxist philosophy in the forefront of the program of the Théorie series Althusser edited, perhaps implicitly signaling a desire to heal the breach between French communist Marxism and the scientific community caused by the Lysenko affair. And he acknowledges his debts to his, quote, masters in reading learned works, end quote, Bachelard, Jean Cavaille, Georges Canguilhem, and Michel Foucault in the book Reading Capital. Footnote. Althusser also paid tribute to the master of Hegel's studies in France, Jean Hippolyte, one of whose last texts was a respectful discussion of his work. In the foreword to his 1981, page 9, Canguilhem acknowledged Althusser's, quote, original contribution, quote, while the introduction to Foucault's 1974 testifies to the temporary impact of the Althusserian rereading of Marx on him. End footnote. Although he attempted to cover himself against the charge of importing non-Marxist elements into Marxism by representing Marx and Engels as Bachelardians avant la lettre, in his resort to Bachelard, as in his alliance with Structuralism, Althusser was in fact engaged in a habitual strategy of Western Marxism, namely a synthesis of Marxism and, quote, bourgeois philosophy. And if Althusser's, quote, road to Marx and, quote, bypassed the Marxism of his peers in favor of contemporary non-Marxist discourses, it simultaneously took a, quote, detour via a classical philosophical system, Spinoza's. Epistemologically, at least, Spinoza and not Hegel was Marx's, quote, historical predecessor, end quote. His rationalist and determinist philosophy was extolled for having, quote, introduced an unprecedented theoretical revolution in the history of philosophy, probably the greatest philosophical revolution of all time, end quote, some of whose key principles Althusser would seek to naturalize to Marxism. Footnote. In Althusser 1972, Althusser had credited Montesquieu with anticipating Marx with a dynamic but non-teleological theory of history. 3 years later, however, Althusser was arguing that the illicit Hegelian notion of totality derived from the Frenchman. It is worth noting that that other contemporary Parisian hero, Nietzsche, occasionally joined the select company of Marx and Freud as artisans of, quote, sciences or of criticism, end quote. End footnote. Althusser's devaluation of French Marxism in favor of other currents in the national culture and of Hegel in favor of Spinoza resulted in an ironic situation. Althusser was not a Stalinist in structuralist clothing, harking back to the days of, quote, diabolical and hysterical materialism, end quote, and hankering after a re-edition of them. On the contrary, fearing that Marxist theory, so recently freed from the grip of Stalinism, was now in the vice of alien theoretical ideologies, and convinced that certain non-Marxist discourses could play a crucial role in releasing it, Althusser engaged in a complex theoretical, quote, war of position, end quote. Yet the fact is that the philosopher who ceaselessly invoked the rigors of orthodoxy against the lax eclecticism of his contemporaries, counterposing the mature to the young Marx, and Stalin, was also, quote, the most promiscuous, of Western Marxists, in allowing non-Marxist influence to affect his ideas, end quote. J. 1984. Whether in consequence Althusser escaped the German ideology only to succumb to the French is a question that will detain us later. New section. For Marx. Read capital. The titles of Althusser's books were slogans. The ambition in motivating his, quote, return to Marx, end quote, was the renewal of Marxist theory. Althusser's endeavor had to comprise 3 interrelated components: critique, reconstruction, and defense, a program of enormous scope. All 3 tasks were to be executed with the aids of theses which many Marxists considered and still do detrimental to Marxism, and with a polemical cutting edge that enraged the partisans of Althusser's targets. His first and overriding concern was to demarcate a space for independent research within the Communist Party of France. Althusser's epistemology was constructed, he related in 1975, quote, in opposition to all forms of pragmatism, to justify the thesis of the relative autonomy of theory, and thus the right of Marxist theory not to be treated as a slave to tactical political decisions, but to be allowed to develop in alliance with political and other practices without betraying its own needs, end quote. Althusser. In the event, this took the form of justifying within Marxism a unity of theory and practice, internal to theory, in other words, an autonomy of theory. The severance between the two characteristic of Western Marxism was endowed with Marxist credentials. Such, quote, idealism was part of the logic of remaining a member of the PCF. In Althusser, the party was the party of the French working class. It potentially posed the only real threat to the order of capital in France. Membership of it was thus a precondition of any kind of organic link with the class struggle. But the price to be paid for a party card and for theory's immunity was high: assent or silence on political issues. On the other hand, if at a stroke Althusser abolished the problem of the union of theory and practice, it was in the name of future political practice. Future political practice. The Marxist workers' movement needed scientific theory in order to, quote, change the world, end quote. Footnote: Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach was pinned to a wall of Althusser's study, according to Machiocci. End footnote. Protected from the ravages of official pragmatism and opportunism, a detour via theory, at this time and in this place, was no diversion from the struggle, but the long-term, practically motivated continuation of politics by other means. At least this was how Althusser understood the theoretical labors of Marx and Lenin. Footnote: see Althusser's letter of the 7th of March 1967 to Regis Debray. Quote, the struggle poses urgent demands, but it is sometimes politically urgent to withdraw for a while and take stock. Everything depends on the theoretical work done at that time. Marx and Lenin gave us our first examples of this. Time thus taken away from the struggle may ultimately be a saving of time, even for the struggle itself. I see this as being the duty of all working class and revolutionary intellectuals. They are entrusted by the people in arms with the guardianship and extension of scientific knowledge. They must fulfill this mission with the utmost care, following in the footsteps of Marx himself, who was convinced that nothing was more important for the struggles of the workers' movement and those waging those struggles than the most profound and accurate knowledge, end quote. Althusser. End footnote. Audacity in theory was to be accompanied politically by tactical moderation in the interest of strategic extremism. An open clash with the party of leadership was to be avoided. The Communist Party of France's political practice was to be transformed by a theoretical labor, insulated from the commotion and caprices of quotidian politics and the exigencies of practical verification, in a France whose polity had been stabilized after 1962 under Gaullist intendancy, and whose economy was rapidly being modernized under technocratic supervision. After all, Lenin, no less, had said that Marxism was omnipotent because it was true, and not vice versa. For Althusser, it was a time for Marxist theory. Quote, today was different. Bypassing the Communist Party of France imprint Édition Sociale, Althusser opened a new series with the leftist publisher François Maspero, entitled simply Théorie. In quick succession, Pour Marx and the 2-volume Lire le Capital appeared in autumn 1965. Quote, for the first time, end quote, writes Anderson, quote, a major theoretical system was articulated within the organizational framework of French communism, whose power and originality were conceded even by its most determined opponents, end quote. Anderson. Perry Anderson. If Althusser's version of dialectical materialism was, at first sight, entirely novel, historical materialism a la Althusser bore little resemblance to what had previously passed for the science of history in the international communist movement. Althusser's open return to Marxism was greeted with distinct coolness by the PCF leadership, fearful of its practical implications. The same year, the Communist Party of China published the book The Polemic on the General Line of the International Communist Movement, inviting a realignment from Moscow to Peking. The Communist Party of France would learn to live with Althusser, if not to love Althusser. Marxist theory had known few projects of such ambition and militancy, and would not be quite the same again. Okay, so that is the end of Chapter 1 of Althusser, The Detour of Theory by Gregory Elliot. Chapter 1 was titled The Moment of Althusser. Thank you so much for listening. The next chapter, Chapter 2, is titled A Recommencement of Dialectical Materialism. Thank you so much for listening.